Part Second, Chapter 8, Part 1 of Nostromo. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Scott Carpenter. Nostromo by Joseph Conrad. Part Second, The Isabels. Chapter 8, Part 1. For a moment, before this extraordinary find, they forgot their own concerns and sensations. Senor Hirsch's sensations as he lay there must have been those of extreme terror. For a long time he refused to give a sign of life, till at last Decoud's objurgations, and perhaps more Nostromo's impatient suggestion that he should be thrown overboard, as he seemed to be dead, induced him to raise one eyelid first and then the other. It appeared that he had never found a safe opportunity to leave Sulaco. He lodged with Anzani, the universal storekeeper, on the Plaza Mayor. But when the riot broke out he had made his escape from his host's house before daylight, and in such a hurry that he had forgotten to put on his shoes. He had run out impulsively in his socks, and with his hat in his hand, into the garden of Anzani's house. Fear gave him the necessary agility to climb over several low walls, and afterwards he blundered into the overgrown cloisters of the ruined Franciscan convent in one of the by-streets. He forced himself into the midst of matted bushes with the recklessness of desperation, and this accounted for his scratched body and his torn clothing. He lay hidden there all day, his tongue cleaving to the roof of his mouth, with all the intensity of thirst engendered by heat and fear. 3 times different bands of men invaded the place with shouts and imprecations, looking for Father Corbelan, but towards the end of the evening, still lying on his face in the bushes, he thought he would die from the fear of silence. He was not very clear as to what had induced him to leave the place, but evidently he had got out and slunk successfully out of town along the deserted back lanes. He wandered in the darkness near the railway, so maddened with apprehension that he dared not even approach the fires of the pickets of Italian workmen guarding the line. He had a vague idea, evidently, of finding refuge in the railway yards. But the dogs rushed in upon him barking, men began to shout, a shot was fired at random. He fled away from the gates. By the merest accident, as it happened, he took the direction of the O.S.N. Company's offices. Twice he stumbled upon the bodies of men killed during the day, but everything living frightened him much more. He crouched, crept, crawled, made dashes, guided by a sort of animal instinct, keeping away from every light and from every sound of voices. His idea was to throw himself at the feet of Captain Mitchell and beg for shelter in the company's offices. It was all dark there as he approached on his hands and knees. But suddenly someone on guard challenged loudly, "Quien vive?" There were more dead men lying about, and he flattened himself down at once by the side of a cold corpse. He heard a voice saying, "Here is one of those wounded rascals crawling about. Shall I go and finish him?" And another voice objected that it was not safe to go out without a lantern upon such an errand. Perhaps it was only some Negro Liberal looking for a chance to stick a knife into the stomach of an honest man. Hirsch didn't stay to hear any more, but crawling away to the end of the wharf, hid himself amongst a lot of empty casks. After a while some people came along, talking and with glowing cigarettes. He did not stop to ask himself whether they would be likely to do him any harm, but bolted incontinently along the jetty, saw a lighter lying moored at the end, and threw himself into it. In his desire to find cover, he crept right forward under the half-deck, and he had remained there, more dead than alive, suffering agonies of hunger and thirst, and almost fainting with terror, when he heard numerous footsteps and the voices of the Europeans, who came in a body escorting the wagon-load of treasure pushed along the rails by a squad of cargadores. He understood perfectly what was being done from the talk, but did not disclose his presence from the fear that he would not be allowed to remain. His only idea at the time, overpowering and masterful, was to get away from this terrible Sulaco. And now he regretted it very much. He had heard Nostromo talk to Decoud, and wished himself back on shore. He did not desire to be involved in any desperate affair in a situation where one could not run away. The involuntary groans of his anguished spirit had betrayed him to the sharp ears of the capataz. They had propped him up in a sitting posture against the side of the lighter, and he went on with the moaning account of his adventures till his voice broke, his head fell forward. "Water," he whispered with difficulty. Decoud held one of the cans to his lips. He revived after an extraordinarily short time, and scrambled up to his feet wildly. Nostromo, in an angry and threatening voice, ordered him forward. Hirsch was one of those men whom fear lashes like a whip, and he must have had an appalling idea of the capataz's ferocity. He displayed an extraordinary agility in disappearing forward into the darkness. They heard him getting over the tarpaulin, then there was the sound of a heavy fall, followed by a weary sigh. Afterwards all was still in the forepart of the lighter, as though he had killed himself in his headlong tumble. Nostromo shouted in a menacing voice, "Lie still there! Do not move a limb! If I hear as much as a loud breath from you, I shall come over there and put a bullet through your head." The mere presence of a coward, however passive, brings an element of treachery into a dangerous situation. Nostromo's nervous impatience passed into gloomy thoughtfulness. Decoud, in an undertone, as if speaking to himself, remarked that, after all, this bizarre event made no great difference. He could not conceive what harm the man could do. At most he would be in the way, like an inanimate and useless object, like a block of wood, for instance. "I would think twice before getting rid of a piece of wood," said Nostromo calmly. "Something may happen unexpectedly where you could make use of it, but in an affair like ours a man like this ought to be thrown overboard. Even if he were as brave as a lion, we would not want him here. We are not running away for our lives. Senor, there is no harm in a brave man trying to save himself with ingenuity and courage. But you have heard his tale, Don Martin. His being here is a miracle of fear." Nostromo paused. "There is no room for fear in this lighter," he added through his teeth. Decoud had no answer to make. It was not a position for argument, for display of scruples or feelings. There were 1,000 ways in which a panic-stricken man could make himself dangerous. It was evident that Hirsch could not be spoken to, reasoned with, or persuaded into a rational line of conduct. The story of his own escape demonstrated that clearly enough. Decoud thought it was 1,000 pities the wretch had not died of fright. Nature, who had made him what he was, seemed to have calculated cruelly how much he could bear in the way of atrocious anguish without actually expiring. Some compassion was due to so much terror. Decoud, though imaginative enough for sympathy, resolved not to interfere with any action that Nostromo would take. But Nostromo did nothing, and the fate of Senor Hirsch remained suspended in the darkness of the gulf, at the mercy of events which could not be foreseen. The capataz, extending his hand, put out the candle suddenly. It was to Decoud as if his companion had destroyed by a single touch the world of affairs, of loves, of revolution, where his complacent superiority analyzed fearlessly all motives and all passions, including his own. He gasped a little. Decoud was affected by the novelty of his position. Intellectually self-confident, he suffered from being deprived of the only weapon he could use with effect. No intelligence could penetrate the darkness of the placid gulf. There remained only one thing he was certain of, and that was the overweening vanity of his companion. It was direct, uncomplicated, naive, and effectual. Decoud, who had been making use of him, had tried to understand his man thoroughly. He had discovered a complete singleness of motive behind the varied manifestations of a consistent character. This was why the man remained so astonishingly simple in the jealous greatness of his conceit. And now there was a complication. It was evident that he resented having been given a task in which there were so many chances of failure. "I wonder," thought Decoud, "how he would behave if I were not here." He heard Nostromo mutter again, "No, there is no room for fear on this lighter. Courage itself does not seem good enough. I have a good eye and a steady hand. No man can say he ever saw me tired or uncertain what to do. But por Dios, Don Martin, I have been sent out into this black calm on a business where neither a good eye nor a steady hand nor judgment are any use." He swore a string of oaths in Spanish and Italian under his breath. "Nothing but sheer desperation will do for this affair." These words were in strange contrast to the prevailing peace, to this almost solid stillness of the gulf. A shower fell with an abrupt whispering sound all round the boat, and Decoud took off his hat, and letting his head get wet, felt greatly refreshed. Presently a steady little draught of air caressed his cheek. The lighter began to move, but the shower distanced it. The drops ceased to fall upon his head and hands. The whispering died out in the distance. Nostromo emitted a grunt of satisfaction, and grasping the tiller, chirruped softly as sailors do to encourage the wind. Never for the last 3 days had Decoud felt less the need for what the capataz would call desperation. "I fancy I hear another shower on the water," he observed in a tone of quiet content. "I hope it will catch us up." Nostromo ceased chirruping at once. "You hear another shower," he said doubtfully. A sort of thinning of the darkness seemed to have taken place, and Decoud could see now the outline of his companion's figure, and even the sail came out of the night like a square block of dense snow. The sound which Decoud had detected came along the water harshly. Nostromo recognized that noise, partaking of a hiss and a rustle, which spreads out on all sides of a steamer making her way through a smooth water on a quiet night. It could be nothing else but the captured transport with troops from Esmeralda. She carried no lights. The noise of her steaming, growing louder every minute, would stop at times altogether and then begin again abruptly, and sound startlingly nearer, as if that invisible vessel whose position could not be precisely guessed were making straight for the lighter. Meantime that last kept on sailing slowly and noiselessly before a breeze so faint that it was only by leaning over the side and feeling the water slip through his fingers that Decoud convinced himself they were moving at all. His drowsy feeling had departed. He was glad to know that the lighter was moving. After so much stillness, the noise of the steamer seemed uproarious and distracting. There was a weirdness in not being able to see her. Suddenly all was still. She had stopped, but so close to them that the steam, blowing off, sent its rumbling vibration right over their heads. "They are trying to make out where they are," said Decoud in a whisper. Again he leaned over and put his fingers into the water. "We are moving quite smartly," he informed Nostromo. "We seem to be crossing her bows," said the capataz in a cautious tone. "But this is a blind game with death. Moving on is of no use. We mustn't be seen or heard." His whisper was hoarse with excitement. Of all his face there was nothing visible but a gleam of white eyeballs. His fingers gripped Decoud's shoulder. "That is the only way to save this treasure from this steamer full of soldiers. Any other would have carried lights, but you observe there is not a gleam to show us where she is." Decoud stood as if paralyzed. Only his thoughts were wildly active. In the space of a second he remembered the desolate glance of Antonia as he left her at the bedside of her father in the gloomy house of Avellanos, with shuttered windows, but all the doors standing open, and deserted by all the servants except an old negro at the gate. He remembered the Casa Gould on his last visit, the arguments, the tones of his voice, the impenetrable attitude of Charles, Mrs. Gould's face so blanched with anxiety and fatigue that her eyes seemed to have changed colour, appearing nearly black by contrast. Even whole sentences of the proclamation which he meant to make Barrios issue from his headquarters at Cayta as soon as he got there passed through his mind. The very germ of the new state, the separationist proclamation, which he had tried before he left to read hurriedly to Don Jose, stretching out on his bed under the fixed gaze of his daughter. God knows whether the old statesman had understood it. He was unable to speak, but he had certainly lifted his arm off the coverlet. His hand had moved as if to make the sign of the cross in the air, a gesture of blessing, of consent. Decoud had that very draft in his pocket, written in pencil on several loose sheets of paper with the heavily printed heading, "Administration of the San Tome Silver Mine, Sulaco, Republic of Costaguana." He had written it furiously, snatching page after page on Charles Gould's table. Mrs. Gould had looked several times over his shoulder as he wrote, but the Senor Administrador, standing straddle-legged, would not even glance at it when it was finished. He had waved it away firmly. It must have been scorn and not caution, since he never made a remark about the use of the administration's paper for such a compromising document. And that showed his disdain, the true English disdain of common prudence, as if everything outside the range of their own thoughts and feelings were unworthy of serious recognition. Decoud had the time, in a second or two, to become furiously angry with Charles Gould and even resentful against Mrs. Gould, in whose care, tacitly it is true, he had left the safety of Antonia. "Better perish 1,000 times than owe your preservation to such people," he exclaimed mentally. The grip of Nostromo's fingers, never removed from his shoulder, tightening fiercely, recalled him to himself. "The darkness is our friend," the capataz murmured into his ear. "I am going to lower the sail and trust our escape to this black gulf. No eyes could make us out, lying silent with a naked mast. I will do it now before this steamer closes still more upon us. The faint creak of a block would betray us, and the San Tome treasure into the hands of those thieves." He moved about as warily as a cat. Decoud heard no sound, and it was only by the disappearance of the square blotch of darkness that he knew the yard had come down, lowered as carefully as if it had been made of glass. Next moment he heard Nostromo's quiet breathing by his side. "You had better not move at all from where you are, Don Martin," advised the capataz earnestly. "You might stumble or displace something which would make a noise. The sweeps and the punting poles are lying about. Move not for your life. Por Dios, Don Martin," he went on in a keen but friendly whisper. "I am so desperate that if I didn't know your worship to be a man of courage, capable of standing stock still whatever happens, I would drive my knife into your heart." A death-like stillness surrounded the lighter. It was difficult to believe that there was near a steamer full of men with many pairs of eyes peering from her bridge for some hint of land in the night. Her steam had ceased blowing off, and she remained stopped, too far off, apparently, for any other sound to reach the lighter. "Perhaps you would, capataz," Decoud began in a whisper. "However, you need not trouble. There are other things than the fear of your knife to keep my heart steady. It shall not betray you. Only have you forgotten? I spoke to you openly as to a man as desperate as myself," explained the capataz. "The silver must be saved from the Monteros. I told Captain Mitchell 3 times that I preferred to go alone. I told Don Carlos Gould, too. I was in the Casa Gould. They had sent for me. The ladies were there, and when I tried to explain why I did not wish to have you with me, they promised me, both of them, great rewards for your safety. A strange way to talk to a man you are sending out to an almost certain death. Those gentle folk do not seem to have sense enough to understand what they are giving one to do. I told them I could do nothing for you. You would have been safer with the bandit Hernandez. It would have been possible to ride out of the town with no greater risk than a chance shot sent after you in the dark. But it was as if they had been deaf. I had to promise I would wait for you under the harbour gate. I did wait. And now, because you are a brave man, you are as safe as the silver. Neither more nor less." At that moment, as if by way of comment upon Nostromo's words, the invisible steamer went ahead at half speed only, as could be judged by the leisurely beat of her propeller. The sound shifted its place markedly, but without coming nearer. It even grew a little more distant right abeam of the lighter, and then ceased again. "They are trying for a sight of the Isabels," muttered Nostromo, "in order to make for the harbour in a straight line and seize the custom house, with the treasure in it. Have you ever seen the commandant of Esmeralda, Sotillo? A handsome fellow with a soft voice. When I first came here I used to see him in the calle, talking to the senoritas at the windows of the houses, and showing his white teeth all the time. But one of my cargadores, who had been a soldier, told me that he had once ordered a man to be flayed alive in the remote campo where he was sent recruiting amongst the people of the estancias. It has never entered his head that the Compania had a man capable of baffling his game." The murmuring loquacity of the capataz disturbed Decoud like a hint of weakness, and yet talkative resolution may be as genuine as grim silence. "Sotillo is not baffled so far," he said. "Have you forgotten that crazy man forward?" Nostromo had not forgotten Senor Hirsch. He reproached himself bitterly for not having visited the lighter carefully before leaving the wharf. He reproached himself for not having stabbed and flung Hirsch overboard at the very moment of discovery without even looking at his face. That would have been consistent with the desperate character of the affair. Whatever happened, Sotillo was already baffled. Even if that wretch, now as silent as death, did anything to betray the nearness of the lighter, Sotillo, if Sotillo it was in command of the troops on board, would still be baffled of his plunder. "I have an axe in my hand," Nostromo whispered wrathfully, "that in 3 strokes would cut through the side down to the water's edge. Moreover, each lighter has a plug in the stern, and I know exactly where it is. I feel it under the sole of my foot." Decoud recognized the ring of genuine determination in the nervous murmurs, the vindictive excitement of the famous capataz. Before the steamer, guided by a shriek or two, for there could be no more than that, Nostromo said, gnashing his teeth audibly, could find the lighter, there would be plenty of time to sink this treasure tied up round his neck. The last words he hissed into Decoud's ear. Decoud said nothing. He was perfectly convinced. The usual characteristic quietness of the man was gone. It was not equal to the situation as he conceived it. Something deeper, something unsuspected by everyone, had come to the surface. Decoud, with careful movements, slipped off his overcoat and divested himself of his boots. He did not consider himself bound in honour to sink with the treasure. His object was to get down to Barrios and Cayta, as the capataz knew very well. And he too meant in his own way to put into that attempt all the desperation of which he was capable. Nostromo muttered, "True, true. You are a politician, senor. Rejoin the army and start another revolution." He pointed out, however, that there was a little boat belonging to every lighter fit to carry 2 men, if not more. Theirs was towing behind. Of that Decoud had not been aware. Of course it was too dark to see, and it was only when Nostromo put his hand upon its painter fastened to a cleat in the stern that he experienced a full measure of relief. The prospect of finding himself in the water and swimming, overwhelmed by ignorance and darkness, probably in a circle, till he sank from exhaustion, was revolting. The barren and cruel futility of such an end intimidated his affectation of careless pessimism. In comparison to it, the chance of being left floating in a boat, exposed to thirst, hunger, discovery, imprisonment, execution, presented itself with an aspect of amenity worth securing even at the cost of some self-contempt. He did not accept Nostromo's proposal that he should get into the boat at once. "Something sudden may overwhelm us, senor," the capataz remarked, promising faithfully at the same time to let go the painter at the moment when the necessity became manifest. But Decoud assured him lightly that he did not mean to take the boat till the very last moment, and that then he meant the capataz to come along too. The darkness of the gulf was no longer for him the end of all things. It was part of a living world, since pervading it failure and death could be felt at your elbow. And at the same time it was a shelter. He exulted in its impenetrable obscurity. Like a wall, he muttered to himself. The only thing which checked his confidence was the thought of Senor Hirsch. Not to have bound and gagged him seemed to Decoud now the height of improvident folly. As long as the miserable creature had the power to raise a yell, he was a constant danger. His abject terror was mute now, but there was no saying from what cause it might suddenly find vent in shrieks. This very madness of fear which both Decoud and Nostromo had seen in the wild and irrational glances and in the continuous twitchings of his mouth protected Senor Hirsch from the cruel necessities of this desperate affair. The moment of silencing him forever had passed. As Nostromo remarked in answer to Decoud's regrets, it was too late. It could not be done without noise, especially in the ignorance of the man's exact position. Wherever he had elected to crouch and tremble, it was too hazardous to go near him. He would begin probably to yell for mercy. It was much better to leave him quite alone, since he was keeping so still. But to trust to his silence became every moment a greater strain upon Decoud's composure. "I wish, capataz, you had not let the right moment pass," he murmured. "What, to silence him forever? I thought it good to hear first how he came to be here. It was too strange. Who could imagine that it was all an accident? Afterwards, senor, when I saw you giving him water to drink, I could not do it. Not after I had seen you holding up the can to his lips as though he were your brother. Senor, that sort of necessity must not be thought of too long. And yet it would have been no cruelty to take away from him his wretched life. It is nothing but fear. Your compassion saved him then, Don Martin, and now it is too late. It couldn't be done without noise." In the steamer they were keeping a perfect silence, and the stillness was so profound that Decoud felt as if the slightest sound conceivable must travel unchecked and audible to the end of the world. What if Hirsch coughed or sneezed? To feel himself at the mercy of such an idiotic contingency was too exasperating to be looked upon with irony. Nostromo, too, seemed to be getting restless. Was it possible, he asked himself, that the steamer, finding the night too dark altogether, intended to remain stopped where she was till daylight? He began to think that this, after all, was the real danger. He was afraid that the darkness, which was his protection, would in the end cause his undoing. Sotillo, as Nostromo had surmised, was in command on board the transport. The events of the last 48 hours in Sulaco were not known to him. Neither was he aware that the telegraphist in Esmeralda had managed to warn his colleague in Sulaco. Like a good many officers of the troops garrisoning the province, Sotillo had been influenced in his adoption of the Ribierist cause by the belief that it had the enormous wealth of the Gould concession on its side. He had been one of the frequenters of the Casa Gould, where he had aired his Blanco convictions and his ardour for reform before Don Jose Avellanos, casting frank, honest glances toward Mrs. Gould and Antonia the while. He was known to belong to a good family, persecuted and impoverished during the tyranny of Guzman Bento. The opinions he expressed appeared eminently natural and proper in a man of his parentage and antecedents. And he was not a deceiver. It was perfectly natural for him to express elevated sentiments, while his whole faculties were taken up with what seemed then a solid and practical notion, the notion that the husband of Antonia Avellanos would be naturally the intimate friend of the Gould concession. He even pointed this out to Anzani once, when negotiating the 6th or 7th small loan in the gloomy, damp apartment, with enormous iron bars, behind the principal shop, in the whole row under the arcades. He hinted to the universal shopkeeper at the excellent terms he was on with the emancipated senorita, who was like a sister to the Englishwoman. He would advance one leg and put his arms akimbo, posing for Anzani's inspection and fixing him with a haughty stare. "Look, miserable shopkeeper, how can a man like me fail with any woman, let alone an emancipated girl living in scandalous freedom?" he seemed to say. His manner in the Casa Gould was of course very different, devoid of all truculence, and even slightly mournful. Like most of his countrymen, he was carried away by the sound of fine words, especially if uttered by himself. He had no convictions of any sort upon anything except as to the irresistible power of his personal advantages. But that was so firm that even Decoud's appearance in Sulaco and his intimacy with the Goulds and the Avellanos did not disquiet him. On the contrary, he tried to make friends with that rich Costaguanero from Europe, in the hope of borrowing a large sum by and by. The only guiding motive of his life was to get money for the satisfaction of his expensive tastes, which he indulged recklessly, having no self-control. He imagined himself a master of intrigue, but his corruption was simple as an animal instinct. At times, in solitude, he had his moments of ferocity, and also on such occasions as, for instance, when, alone in a room with Anzani, trying to get a loan. He had talked himself into the command of the Esmeralda garrison. That small seaport had its importance as the station of the main submarine cable connecting the Occidental provinces with the outer world, and the junction with it of the Sulaco branch. Don Jose Avellanos proposed him, and Barrios, with a rude and jeering guffaw, had said, "Oh, let Sotillo go. He's a very good man to keep guard over the cable, and the ladies of Esmeralda ought to have their turn." Barrios, an indubitably brave man, had no great opinion of Sotillo. End of Chapter 8, Part 1. Second, Chapter 8, Part 2 of Nostromo. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Scott Carpenter. Nostromo by Joseph Conrad. Part 2nd, The Isabels. Chapter 8, Part 2. It was through the Esmeralda cable alone that the San Tome mine could be kept in constant touch with the great financier, whose tacit approval made the strength of the Ribierist movement. This movement had its adversaries even there. Sotillo governed Esmeralda with repressive severity, till the adverse course of events upon the distant theatre of civil war forced upon him the reflection that after all the great silver mine was fated to become the spoil of the victors. But caution was necessary. He began by assuming a dark and mysterious attitude towards the faithful Ribierist municipality of Esmeralda. Later on, the information that the Commandant was holding assemblies of officers in the dead of night, which had leaked out somehow, caused those gentlemen to neglect their civil duties altogether and remain shut up in their houses. Suddenly one day all the letters from Sulaco by the overland courier were carried off by a file of soldiers from the post office to the commandancia, without disguise, concealment, or apology. Sotillo had heard through Cayta of the final defeat of Ribera. This was the first open sign of the change in his convictions. Presently notorious Democrats, who had been living till then in constant fear of arrest, leg irons, and even floggings, could be observed going in and out of the great door of the commandancia, where the horses of the orderlies doze under their heavy saddles, while the men in ragged uniforms and pointed straw hats lounge on a bench, with their naked feet stuck out beyond the strip of shade, and a sentry, in a red baize coat with holes at the elbows, stands at the top of the steps glaring haughtily at the common people, who uncover their heads to him as they pass. Sotillo's ideas did not soar above the care for his personal safety and the chance of plundering the town in his charge, but he feared that such late adhesion would earn but scant gratitude from the victors. He had believed just a little too long in the power of the San Tome mine. The seized correspondence had confirmed his previous information of a large amount of silver ingots lying in the Sulaco custom house. To gain possession of it would be a clear Monterist move, a sort of service that would have to be rewarded. With the silver in his hands he could make terms for himself and his soldiers. He was aware neither of the riots nor of the President's escape to Sulaco and the close pursuit led by Montero's brother, the guerrillero. The game seemed in his own hands. The initial moves were the seizure of the cable telegraph office and the securing of the government steamer lying in the narrow creek which is the harbor of Esmeralda. The last was effected without difficulty by a company of soldiers swarming with a rush over the gangways as she lay alongside the quay. But the lieutenant charged with the duty of arresting the telegraphist halted on the way before the only cafe in Esmeralda, where he distributed some brandy to his men, and refreshed himself at the expense of the owner, a known Ribierist. The whole party became intoxicated and proceeded on their mission up the street, yelling and firing random shots at the windows. This little festivity, which might have turned out dangerous to the telegraphist's life, enabled him in the end to send his warning to Sulaco. The lieutenant, staggering upstairs with a drawn sabre, was before long kissing him on both cheeks in one of those swift changes of mood peculiar to a state of drunkenness. He clasped the telegraphist close round the neck, assuring him that all the officers of the Esmeralda garrison were going to be made colonels, while tears of happiness streamed down his sodden face. Thus it came about that the town major, coming along later, found the whole party sleeping on the stairs and in passages, and the telegraphist, who scorned this chance of escape, very busy clicking the key of the transmitter. The major led him away bareheaded, with his hands tied behind his back, but concealed the truth from Sotillo, who remained in ignorance of the warning dispatched to Sulaco. The colonel was not the man to let any sort of darkness stand in the way of the planned surprise. It appeared to him a dead certainty. His heart was set upon his object with an ungovernable, childlike impatience. Ever since the steamer had rounded Punta Mala to enter the deeper shadow of the Gulf, he had remained on the bridge in a group of officers as excited as himself. Distracted between the coaxings and menaces of Sotillo and his staff, the miserable commander of the steamer kept her moving with as much prudence as they would let him exercise. Some of them had been drinking heavily, no doubt, but the prospect of laying hands on so much wealth made them absurdly foolhardy, and at the same time extremely anxious. The old major of the battalion, a stupid, suspicious man who had never been afloat in his life, distinguished himself by putting out suddenly the binnacle light, the only one allowed on board for the necessities of navigation. He could not understand of what use it could be for finding the way. To the vehement protestations of the ship's captain, he stamped his foot and tapped the handle of his sword. "Aha! I have unmasked you!" he cried triumphantly. "You are tearing your hair out from despair at my acuteness. Am I a child, to believe that a light in that brass box can show you where the harbor is? I am an old soldier, I am. I can smell a traitor a league off. You wanted that gleam to betray our approach to your friend, the Englishman. A thing like that show you the way. What a miserable lie! Que picardia! You Sulaco people are all in the pay of those foreigners. You deserve to be run through the body with my sword." Other officers, crowding round, tried to calm his indignation, repeating persuasively, "No, no, this is an appliance of the mariners, Major. This is no treachery." The captain of the transport flung himself face downwards on the bridge, and refused to rise. "Put an end to me at once," he repeated in a stifled voice. Sotillo had to interfere. The uproar and confusion on the bridge became so great that the helmsman fled from the wheel. He took refuge in the engine room, and alarmed the engineers, who, disregarding the threats of the soldiers set on guard over them, stopped the engines, protesting that they would rather be shot than run the risk of being drowned down below. This was the first time Nostromo and Decoud heard the steamer stop. After order had been restored and the binnacle lamp relighted, she went ahead again, passing wide of the lighter in her search for the Isabels. The group could not be made out, and at the pitiful entreaties of the captain, Sotillo allowed the engines to be stopped again to wait for one of those periodical lightenings of the darkness caused by the shifting of the cloud canopy spread above the waters of the Gulf. Sotillo on the bridge muttered from time to time angrily to the captain. The other, in an apologetic and cringing tone, begged Su Merced, the colonel, to take into consideration the limitations put upon human faculties by the darkness of the night. Sotillo swelled with rage and impatience. It was the chance of a lifetime. "If your eyes are no more use to you than this, I shall have them put out," he yelled. The captain of the steamer made no answer, for just then the masts of the Great Isabel loomed up darkly after a passing shower, then vanished, as if swept away by a wave of greater obscurity preceding another downpour. This was enough for him. In the voice of a man come back to life again, he informed Sotillo that in an hour he would be alongside the Sulaco wharf. The ship was put then full speed on the course, and a great bustle of preparation for landing arose among the soldiers on her deck. It was heard distinctly by Decoud and Nostromo. The capataz understood its meaning. They had made out the Isabels, and were going on now in a straight line for Sulaco. He judged that they would pass close, but believed that lying still like this, with the sail lowered, the lighter could not be seen. "No, not even if they rubbed sides with us," he muttered. The rain began to fall again, first like a wet mist, then with a heavier touch, thickening into a smart perpendicular downpour, and the hiss and thump of the approaching steamer was coming extremely near. Decoud, with his eyes full of water and lowered head, asked himself how long it would be before she drew past, when unexpectedly he felt a lurch. An inrush of foam broke swishing over the stern, simultaneously with a crack of timbers and a staggering shock. He had the impression of an angry hand laying hold of the lighter and dragging it along to destruction. The shock, of course, had knocked him down, and he found himself rolling in a lot of water at the bottom of the lighter. A violent churning went on alongside. A strange and amazed voice cried out something above him in the night. He heard a piercing shriek for help from Senor Hirsch. He kept his teeth hard set all the time. It was a collision. The steamer had struck the lighter obliquely, heeling her over till she was half swamped, starting some of her timbers, and swinging her head parallel to her own course with the force of the blow. The shock of it on board of her was hardly perceptible. All the violence of that collision was, as usual, felt only on board the smaller craft. Even Nostromo himself thought that this was perhaps the end of his desperate adventure. He too had been flung away from the long tiller, which took charge in the lurch. Next moment the steamer would have passed on, leaving the lighter to sink or swim after having shouldered her thus out of her way, and without even getting a glimpse of her form, had it not been that, being deeply laden with stores and the great number of people on board, her anchor was low enough to hook itself into one of the wire shrouds of the lighter's mast. For the space of 2 or 3 gasping breaths that new rope held against the sudden strain. It was this that gave Decoud the sensation of the snatching pull, dragging the lighter away to destruction. The cause of it, of course, was inexplicable to him. The whole thing was so sudden that he had no time to think. But all his sensations were perfectly clear. He had kept complete possession of himself. In fact, he was even pleasantly aware of that calmness at the very moment of being pitched head first over the transom to struggle on his back in a lot of water. Senor Hirsch's shriek he had heard and recognized while he was regaining his feet, always with that mysterious sensation of being dragged headlong through the darkness. Not a word, not a cry escaped him. He had no time to see anything, and following upon the despairing screams for help, the dragging motion ceased so suddenly that he staggered forward with open arms and fell against the pile of the treasure boxes. He clung to them instinctively, in the vague apprehension of being flung about again, and immediately he heard another lot of shrieks for help, prolonged and despairing, not near him at all, but unaccountably in the distance, away from the lighter altogether, as if some spirit in the night were mocking at Senor Hirsch's terror and despair. Then all was still as when you wake up in your bed in a dark room from a bizarre and agitated dream. The lighter rocked slightly, the rain was still falling. 2 groping hands took hold of his bruised sides from behind, and the capataz's voice whispered in his ear, "Silence, for your life! Silence! The steamer has stopped." Decoud listened. The gulf was dumb. He felt the water nearly up to his knees. "Are we sinking?" he asked in a faint breath. "I don't know," Nostromo breathed back to him. "Senor, make not the slightest sound." Hirsch, when ordered forward by Nostromo, had not returned into his first hiding place. He had fallen near the mast and had no strength to rise. Moreover, he feared to move. He had given himself up for dead, but not on any rational grounds. It was simply a cruel and terrifying feeling. Whenever he tried to think what would become of him, his teeth would start chattering violently. He was too absorbed in the utter misery of his fear to take notice of anything. Though he was stifling under the lighter's sail, which Nostromo had unwittingly lowered on top of him, he did not even dare to put out his head till the very moment of the steamer striking. Then, indeed, he leaped right out, spurred on to new miracles of bodily vigor by this new shape of danger. The inrush of water when the lighter heeled over unsealed his lips. His shriek, "Save me!" was the first distinct warning of the collision for the people on board the steamer. Next moment the wire shroud parted, and the released anchor swept over the lighter's forecastle. It came against the breast of Senor Hirsch, who simply seized hold of it without in the least knowing what it was, but curling his arms and legs upon the part above the fluke with an invincible, unreasonable tenacity. The lighter yawned off wide, and the steamer, moving on, carried him away, clinging hard and shouting for help. It was some time, however, after the steamer had stopped, that his position was discovered. His sustained yelping for help seemed to come from somebody swimming in the water. At last a couple of men went over the bows and hauled him on board. he was carried straight off to Sotillo on the bridge. His examination confirmed the impression that some craft had been run over and sunk, but it was impracticable on such a dark night to look for the positive proof of floating wreckage. Sotillo was more anxious than ever now to enter the harbour without loss of time. The idea that he had destroyed the principal object of his expedition was too intolerable to be accepted. This feeling made the story he had heard appear the more incredible. Senor Hirsch, after being beaten a little for telling lies, was thrust into the chart room. But he was beaten only a little. His tale had taken the heart out of Sotillo's staff, though they all repeated round their chief, "Impossible! Impossible!" with the exception of the old major, who triumphed gloomily. I told you, he mumbled. I could smell some treachery, some diableria, a league off. Meantime, the steamer had kept on her way towards Sulaco, where only the truth of that matter could be ascertained. Decoud and Nostromo heard the loud churning of her propeller diminish and die out, and then, with no useless words, busied themselves in making for the Isabels. The last shower had brought with it a gentle but steady breeze. The danger was not over yet, and there was no time for talk. The lighter was leaking like a sieve. They splashed in the water at every step. The capataz put into Decoud's hand the handle of the pump which was fitted at the side aft, and at once, without question or remark, Decoud began to pump in utter forgetfulness of every desire but that of keeping the treasure afloat. Nostromo hoisted the sail, flew back to the tiller, pulled at the sheet like mad. The short flare of a match they had been kept dry in a tight tin box, though the man himself was completely wet disclosed to the toiling Decoud the eagerness of his face, bent low over the box of the compass, and the attentive stare of his eyes. He knew now where he was, and he hoped to run the sinking lighter ashore in the shallow cove, where the high cliff-like end of the Great Isabel is divided in two equal parts by a deep and overgrown ravine. Decoud pumped without intermission. Nostromo steered without relaxing for a second the intense, peering effort of his stare. Each of them was as if utterly alone with his task. It did not occur to them to speak. There was nothing in common between them but the knowledge that the damaged lighter must be slowly but surely sinking. In that knowledge, which was like the crucial test of their desires, they seemed to have become completely estranged, as if they had discovered in the very shock of the collision that the loss of the lighter would not mean the same thing to them both. This common danger brought their differences in aim, in view, in character, and in position into absolute prominence in the private vision of each. There was no bond of conviction, of common idea. They were merely two adventurers pursuing his own adventure, involved in the same imminence of deadly peril. Therefore they had nothing to say to each other. But this peril, this only incontrovertible truth in which they shared, seemed to act as an inspiration to their mental and bodily powers. There was certainly something almost miraculous in the way the capataz made the cove with nothing but the shadowy hint of the island's shape, and the vague gleam of a small sandy strip for a guide. Where the ravine opens between the cliffs, and a slender, shallow rivulet meanders out of the bushes to lose itself in the sea, the lighter was run ashore, and the two men, with a taciturn, undaunted energy, began to discharge her precious freight, carrying each ox-hide box up the bed of the rivulet beyond the bushes to a hollow place which the caving in of the soil had made below the roots of a large tree. Its big, smooth trunk leaned like a falling column far over the trickle of water running amongst the loose stones. A couple of years before, Nostromo had spent a whole Sunday, all alone, exploring the island. He explained this to Decoud after their task was done, and they sat, weary in every limb, with their legs hanging down the low bank and their backs against the tree, like a pair of blind men, aware of each other and their surroundings by some indefinable sixth sense. "Yes," Nostromo repeated. "I'd never forget a place I have carefully looked at once." He spoke slowly, almost lazily, as if there had been a whole leisurely life before him instead of the scanty 2 hours before daylight. The existence of the treasure, barely concealed in this improbable spot, laid a burden of secrecy upon every contemplated step, upon every intention and plan of future conduct. He felt the partial failure of this desperate affair, and trusted to the great reputation he had known how to make for himself. However, it was also a partial success. His vanity was half appeased. His nervous irritation had subsided. "You never know what may be of use," he pursued with his usual quietness of tone and manner. "I spent a whole miserable Sunday in exploring this crumb of land." "A misanthropic sort of occupation," muttered Decoud viciously.
You had no money, I suppose, to gamble with and to fling out amongst the girls in your usual haunts, capataz." "Vero!" exclaimed the capataz, surprised into the use of his native tongue by so much perspicacity. "I had not. Therefore I did not want to go amongst those beggarly people accustomed to my generosity. It is looked for from the capataz of the cargadores, who are the rich men, and, as it were, the caballeros amongst the common people. I don't care for cards but as a pastime, and as to those girls that boast of having opened their doors to my knock, you know I wouldn't look at any one of them twice except for what the people would say. They are queer, the good people of Sulaco, and I've got much useful information simply by listening patiently to the talk of the women that everybody believed I was in love with. Poor Teresa could never understand that. On that particular Sunday, senor, she scolded so that I went out of the house swearing that I would never darken their door again unless to fetch away my hammock and my chest of clothes. Senor, there's nothing more exasperating than to hear a woman you respect rail against your good reputation when you have not a single brass coin in your pocket. I untied one of the small boats and pulled myself out of the harbor with nothing but 3 cigars in my pocket to help me spend the day on this island. But the water of this rivulet you hear under your feet is cool and sweet and good, senor, both before and after a smoke." He was silent for a while, then added reflectively, "That was the first Sunday after I brought down the white-whiskered English Rico all the way down the mountains from the Paramo on the top of the Entrada Pass. And in the coach, too. No coach had gone up or down that mountain road within the memory of man, senor, till I brought this one down in charge of 50 peons working like one man with ropes, pickaxes, and poles under my direction. That was the rich Englishman who, as the people say, pays for the making of this railway. He was very pleased with me, but my wages were not due till the end of the month." He slid down the bank suddenly. Decoud heard the splash of his feet in the brook and followed his footsteps down the ravine. His form was lost among the bushes till he had reached the strip of sand under the cliff. As often happens in the Gulf when the showers during the first part of the night had been frequent and heavy, the darkness had thinned considerably towards the morning, though there were no signs of daylight as yet. The cargo lighter, relieved of its precious burden, rocked feebly, half afloat, with her forefoot on the sand. A long rope stretched away like a black cotton thread across the strip of white beach to the grapnel Nostromo had carried ashore and hooked to the stern of a tree-like shrub in the very opening of the ravine. There was nothing for Decoud but to remain on the island. He received from Nostromo's hands whatever food the foresight of Captain Mitchell had put on board the lighter, and deposited it temporarily in the little dinghy which, upon their arrival, they had hauled up and out of sight amongst the bushes. It was to be left with him. The island was to be a hiding place, not a prison. He could pull out to a passing ship. The O.S.N. Company's mail boats passed close to the islands when going into Sulaco from the north, but the Minerva carrying off the ex-president had taken the news up north of the disturbances in Sulaco. It was possible that the next steamer down would get instructions to miss the port altogether, since the town, as far as the Minerva's officers knew, was for the time being in the hands of the rabble. This would mean that there would be no steamer for a month as far as the mail service went, but Decoud had to take his chance of that. The island was his only shelter from the proscription hanging over his head. The capataz was, of course, going back. The unloaded lighter leaked much less, and he thought that she would keep afloat as far as the harbour. He passed to Decoud standing knee-deep alongside one of the 2 spades which belonged to the equipment of each lighter for use when ballasting ships. By working with it carefully, as soon as there was daylight enough to see, Decoud could loosen a mass of earth and stones overhanging the cavity in which they had deposited the treasure, so that it would look as if it had fallen naturally. It would cover up not only the cavity, but even all traces of their work, the footsteps, the displaced stones, and even the broken bushes. Besides, who would think of looking either for you or the treasure here? Nostromo continued, as if he could not tear himself away from the spot. Nobody is ever likely to come here. What could any man want with this piece of earth as long as there is room for his feet on the mainland? The people in this country are not curious. There are even no fishermen here to intrude upon your worship. All the fishing that is done in the Gulf goes on near Zapiga, over there. Senor, if you are forced to leave this island before anything can be arranged for you, do not try to make for Zapiga. It is a settlement of thieves and matreros, where they would cut your throat promptly for the sake of your gold watch and chain. And, senor, think twice before confiding in anyone whatever, even in the officers of the company's steamers.
if you ever get on board one. Honesty alone is not enough for security. You must look to discretion and prudence in a man. And always remember, senor, before you open your lips for a confidence, that this treasure may be left safely here for hundreds of years. Time is on its side, senor, and silver is an incorruptible metal that can be trusted to keep its value forever. An incorruptible metal, he repeated as if the idea had given him a profound pleasure. As some men are said to be, Decoud pronounced inscrutably, while the capataz, who busied himself in bailing out the lighter with a wooden bucket, went on throwing the water over the side with a regular splash. Decoud, incorrigible in his skepticism, reflected not cynically, but with a general satisfaction, that this man was made incorruptible by his enormous vanity, that finest form of egoism which can take on the aspect of every virtue. Nostromo ceased bailing, and, as if struck with a sudden thought, dropped the bucket with a clatter into the lighter. "Have you any message?" he asked in a lowered voice. "Remember, I shall be asked questions." "You must find the hopeful words that ought to be spoken to the people in town. I trust for that your intelligence and your experience, capataz. You understand?" "Si, senor. For the ladies." "Yes, yes," said Decoud hastily. "Your wonderful reputation will make them attach a great value to your words. Therefore, be careful what you say. I am looking forward," he continued, feeling the fatal touch of contempt for himself to which his complex nature was subject. "I am looking forward to a glorious and successful ending to my mission. Do you hear, capataz? Use the words glorious and successful when you speak to the senorita. Your own mission is accomplished gloriously and successfully. You have indubitably saved the silver of the mine. Not only this silver, but probably all the silver that shall ever come out of it." Nostromo detected the ironic tone. "I dare say, Senor Don Martin," he said moodily, "there are very few things that I am not equal to. Ask the foreign signori. I, a man of the people, who cannot always understand what you mean. But as to this lot which I must leave here, let me tell you that I would believe it a greater safety if you had not been with me at all." An exclamation escaped Decoud, and a short pause followed. "Shall I go back with you to Sulaco?" he asked in an angry tone. "Shall I strike you dead with my knife where you stand?" retorted Nostromo contemptuously. "It would be the same thing as taking you to Sulaco. Come, senor, your reputation is in your politics, and mine is bound up with the fate of this silver. Do you wonder I wish there had been no other man to share my knowledge? I wanted no one with me, senor." "You could not have kept the lighter afloat without me," Decoud almost shouted. "You would have gone to the bottom with her." "Yes," uttered Nostromo, slowly. "Alone." Here was a man, Decoud reflected, that seemed as though he would have preferred to die rather than deface the perfect form of his egoism. Such a man was safe. In silence he helped the capataz to get the grapnel on board. Nostromo cleared the shelving shore with one push of the heavy oar, and Decoud found himself solitary on the beach like a man in a dream. A sudden desire to hear a human voice once more seized upon his heart. The lighter was hardly distinguishable from the black water upon which she floated. "What do you think has become of Hirsch?" he shouted. "Knocked overboard and drowned," cried Nostromo's voice confidently out of the black wastes of sky and sea around the islet. "Keep close in the ravine, senor. I shall try to come out to you in a night or two." A slight swishing rustle showed that Nostromo was setting the sail. It filled all at once with a sound as of a single loud drum tap. Decoud went back to the ravine. Nostromo at the tiller looked back from time to time at the vanishing mass of the Great Isabel, which little by little merged into the uniform texture of the night. At last, when he turned his head again, he saw nothing but a smooth darkness like a solid wall. Then he too experienced that feeling of solitude which had weighed heavily on Decoud after the lighter had slipped off the shore. But while the man on the island was oppressed by a bizarre sense of unreality affecting the very ground upon which he walked, the mind of the capataz of the cargadores turned alertly to the problem of future conduct. Nostromo's faculties, working on parallel lines, enabled him to steer straight, to keep a lookout for Hermosa, near which he had to pass, and to try to imagine what would happen tomorrow in Sulaco. Tomorrow, or as a matter of fact, today, since the dawn was not very far, Sotillo would find out in what way the treasure had gone. A gang of cargadores had been employed in loading it into a railway truck from custom house storerooms, and running the truck onto the wharf. There would be arrests made, and certainly before noon Sotillo would know in what manner the silver had left Sulaco, and who it was that took it out. Nostromo's intention had been to sail right into the harbour, but at this thought, by a sudden touch of the tiller, he threw the lighter into the wind and checked her rapid way. His reappearance with the very boat would raise suspicions, would cause surmises, would absolutely put Sotillo on the track. He himself would be arrested, and once in the calabozo there was no saying what they would do to him to make him speak. He trusted himself, but he stood up to look round. Nearby, Hermosa showed low its white surface as flat as a table, with the slight run of the sea raised by the breeze washing over its edges noisily. The lighter must be sunk at once. He allowed her to drift with her sail aback. There was already a good deal of water in her. He allowed her to drift towards the harbour entrance, and letting the tiller swing about, squatted down and busied himself in loosening the plug. With that out, she would fill very quickly, and every lighter carried a little iron ballast, enough to make her go down when full of water. When he stood up again, the noisy wash about the Hermosa sounded far away, almost inaudible, and already he could make out the shape of land about the harbour entrance. This was a desperate affair, and he was a good swimmer. A mile was nothing to him, and he knew of an easy place for landing just below the earthworks of the old abandoned fort. It occurred to him with a peculiar fascination that this fort was a good place in which to sleep the day through after so many sleepless nights. With one blow of the tiller he unshipped for the purpose. He knocked the plug out, but did not take the trouble to lower the sail. He felt the water welling up heavily about his legs before he leaped onto the taffrail. There, upright and motionless, in his shirt and trousers only, he stood waiting. When he had felt her settle, he sprang far away with a mighty splash. At once he turned his head. The gloomy, clouded dawn from behind the mountains showed him on the smooth waters the upper corner of the sail, a dark, wet triangle of canvas waving slightly to and fro. He saw it vanish, as if jerked under, and then struck out for the shore. End of Chapter 8, Part 2.
Chapter 1 of Nostromo. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Bologna Times. Nostromo by Joseph Conrad. Part 3. The Lighthouse. Chapter 1. Directly the cargo boat had slipped away from the wharf and got lost in the darkness of the harbor, the Europeans of Sulaco separated to prepare for the coming of the Monterist regime, which was approaching Sulaco from the mountains as well as from the sea. This bit of manual work in loading the silver was their last concerted action. It ended the 3 days of danger, during which, according to the newspaper press of Europe, their energy had preserved the town from the calamities of popular disorder. At the shore end of the jetty, Captain Mitchell said good night and turned back. His intention was to walk the planks of the wharf till the steamer from Esmeralda turned up. The engineers of the railway staff, collecting their Basque and Italian workmen, marched them away to the railway yards, leaving the custom house, so well defended on the first day of the riot, standing open to the four winds of heaven. Their men had conducted themselves bravely and faithfully during the famous 3 days of Sulaco. In a great part, this faithfulness and that courage had been exercised in self-defense rather than in the cause of those material interests to which Charles Gould had pinned his faith. Amongst the cries of the mob, not the least loud had been the cry of death to foreigners. It was, indeed, a lucky circumstance for Sulaco that the relations of those imported workmen with the people of the country had been uniformly bad from the first. Dr. Monygham, going to the door of Viola's kitchen, observed this retreat marking the end of the foreign interference, this withdrawal of the army of material progress from the field of Costaguana revolutions. Algarobi torches, carried on the outskirts of the moving body, sent their penetrating aroma into his nostrils. Their light, sweeping along the front of the house, made the letters of the inscription Albergo d'Italia Una leap out black from end to end of the long wall. His eyes blinked in the clear blaze. Several young men, mostly fair and tall, shepherding this mob of dark bronzed heads surmounted by the glint of slanting rifle barrels, nodded to him familiarly as they went by. The doctor was a well-known character. Some of them wondered what he was doing there. Then, on the flank of their workmen, they tramped on, following the line of rails. "Withdrawing your people from the harbour?" said the doctor, addressing himself to the chief engineer of the railway, who had accompanied Charles Gould so far on his way to the town, walking by the side of the horse, with his hand on the saddle-bow. They had stopped just outside the open door to let the workmen cross the road. "As quick as I can. We are not a political faction," answered the engineer, meaningly, "and we are not going to give our new rulers a handle against the railway. You approve me, Gould?" "Absolutely," said Charles Gould's impassive voice, high up and outside the dim parallelogram of light falling on the road through the open door. With Sotillo expected from one side, and Pedro Montero from the other, the engineer-in-chief's only anxiety now was to avoid a collision with either. Sulaco, for him, was a railway station, a terminus, workshops, a great accumulation of stores. As against the mob the railway defended its property, but politically the railway was neutral. He was a brave man, and in that spirit of neutrality he had carried proposals of truce to the self-appointed chiefs of the popular party, the deputies Fuentes and Gamacho. Bullets were still flying about when he had crossed the plaza on that mission, waving above his head a white napkin belonging to the table linen of the Amarilla Club. He was rather proud of this exploit, and reflecting that the doctor, busy all day with the wounded and the patio of the Casa Gould, had not had time to hear the news, he began a succinct narrative. He had communicated to them the intelligence from the construction camp as to Pedro Montero. The brother of the victorious general, he had assured them, could be expected at Sulaco at any time now. The news, as he anticipated, when shouted out of the window by Señor Gamacho, induced a rush of the mob along the Campo road towards Rincon. The two deputies also, after shaking hands with him effusively, mounted and galloped off to meet the great man. "I have misled them a little as to the time," the chief engineer confessed. "However hard he rides, he can scarcely get here before the morning, but my object is attained. I've secured several hours' peace for the losing party. But I did not tell them anything about Sotillo, for fear they would take it into their heads to try to get hold of the harbour again, either to oppose him or welcome him. There's no saying which. There was Gould's silver, on which rests the remnant of our hopes. Decoud's retreat had to be thought of, too. I think the railway has done pretty well by its friends without compromising itself hopelessly. Now the parties must be left to themselves." "Costaguana for the Costaguaneros," interjected the doctor, sardonically. "It is a fine country, and they have raised a fine crop of hates, vengeance, murder, and rapine, those sons of the country." "Well, I am one of them." Charles Gould's voice sounded calmly. "And I must be going on to see to my own crop of trouble. My wife has driven straight on, doctor?" "Yes. All was quiet on this side. Mrs. Gould has taken the two girls with her." Charles Gould rode on, and the engineer-in-chief followed the doctor indoors. "That man is calmness personified," he said, appreciatively, dropping on a bench, and stretching his well-shaped legs in cycling stockings nearly across the doorway. "He must be extremely sure of himself." "If that's all he is sure of, then he is sure of nothing," said the doctor. He had perched himself again on the end of the table. He nursed his cheek in the palm of one hand, while the other sustained the elbow. "It is the last thing a man ought to be sure of." The candle, half consumed and burning dimly with a long wick, lighted up from below his inclined face, whose expression affected by the drawn-in cicatrices in the cheeks, had something vaguely unnatural, an exaggerated remorseful bitterness. As he sat there he had the air of meditating upon sinister things. The engineer-in-chief gazed at him for a time before he protested. "I really don't see that. For me there seems to be nothing else. However—" He was a wise man, but he could not quite conceal his contempt for that sort of paradox. In fact, Dr. Monygham was not liked by the Europeans of Sulaco. His outward aspect of an outcast, which he preserved even in Mrs. Gould's drawing room, provoked unfavorable criticism. There could be no doubt of his intelligence, and as he had lived for over 20 years in the country, the pessimism of his outlook could not be altogether ignored. But instinctively, in self-defense of their activities and hopes, his hearers put it to the account of some hidden imperfection in the man's character. It was known that many years before, when quite young, he had been made by Guzman Bento chief medical officer of the army. Not one of the Europeans then in the service of Costaguana had been so much liked and trusted by the fierce old dictator. Afterwards his story was not so clear. It lost itself amongst the innumerable tales of conspiracies and plots against the tyrant as a stream is lost in an arid belt of sandy country before it emerges, diminished and troubled, perhaps on the other side. The doctor made no secret of it that he had lived for years in the wildest parts of the Republic, wandering with almost unknown Indian tribes in the great forests of the far interior where the great rivers have their sources. But it was mere aimless wandering. He had written nothing, collected nothing, brought nothing for science out of the twilight of the forests, which seemed to cling to his battered personality, limping about Sulaco, where it had drifted in casually, only to get stranded on the shores of the sea. It was also known that he had lived in a state of destitution till the arrival of the Goulds from Europe. Don Carlos and Dona Emilia had taken up the mad English doctor, when it became apparent that for all his savage independence he could be tamed by kindness. Perhaps it was only hunger that had tamed him. In years gone by he had certainly been acquainted with Charles Gould's father in Santa Marta, and now, no matter what were the dark passages of his history, as the medical officer of the San Tome mine, he became a recognized personality. He was recognized, but not unreservedly accepted. So much defiant eccentricity and such an outspoken scorn for mankind seemed to point to mere recklessness of judgment, the bravado of guilt. Besides, since he had become again of some account, vague whispers had been heard that years ago, when fallen into disgrace and thrown into prison by Guzman Bento at the time of the so-called Great Conspiracy, he had betrayed some of his best friends amongst the conspirators. Nobody pretended to believe that whisper. The whole story of the Great Conspiracy was hopelessly involved and obscure. It is admitted in Costaguana that there never had been a conspiracy, except in the diseased imagination of the tyrant, and therefore nothing and no one to betray, though the most distinguished Costaguaneros had been imprisoned and executed upon that accusation. The procedure had dragged on for years, decimating the better class like a pestilence. The mere expression of sorrow for the fate of executed kinsmen had been punished with death. Don Jose Avellanos was perhaps the only one living who knew the whole story of those unspeakable cruelties. He had suffered from them himself, and he, with a shrug of the shoulders and a nervous, jerky gesture of the arm, was wont to put away from him, as it were, every allusion to it. But whatever the reason, Dr. Monygham, a personage in the administration of the Gould concession, treated with reverent awe by the miners, and indulged in his peculiarities by Mrs. Gould, remained somehow outside the pale. It was not from any liking for the doctor that the engineer-in-chief had lingered in the inn upon the plain. He liked old Viola much better. He had come to look upon the Albergo d'Italia Una as a dependence of the railway. Many of his subordinates had their quarters there. Mrs. Gould's interest in the family conferred upon it a sort of distinction. The engineer-in-chief with an army of workers under his orders, appreciated the moral influence of the old Garibaldino upon his countrymen. His austere, old-world republicanism had a severe, soldier-like standard of faithfulness and duty, as if the world were a battlefield where men had to fight for the sake of universal love and brotherhood, instead of a more or less large share of booty. "Poor old chap," he said, after he had heard the doctor's account of Teresa. "He'll never be able to keep the place going by himself. I shall be sorry." "He's quite alone up there," grunted Dr. Monygham, with a toss of his heavy head towards the narrow staircase. "Every living soul has cleared out, and Mrs. Gould took the girls away just now. It might not be over safe for them out here before very long. Of course, as a doctor I can do nothing more here, but she has asked me to stay with old Viola, and as I have no horse to get back to the mine where I ought to be, I made no difficulty to stay. They can do without me in the town." "I have a good mind to remain with you, doctor, till we see whether anything happens tonight at the harbor," declared the engineer in chief. "He must not be molested by Sotillo's soldiery, who may push on as far as this at once. Sotillo used to be very cordial to me at the Goulds' and at the club. How that man'll ever dare to look any of his friends here in the face I can't imagine." "He'll no doubt begin by shooting some of them to get over the first awkwardness," said the doctor. "Nothing in this country serves better your military man who has changed sides than a few summary executions." He spoke with a gloomy positiveness that left no room for protest. The engineer in chief did not attempt any. He simply nodded several times regretfully, then said: "I think we shall be able to mount you in the morning, doctor. Our peons have recovered some of our stampeded horses. By riding hard and taking a wide circuit by Los Hatos and along the edge of the forest, clear of Rincon altogether, you may hope to reach the San Tome bridge without being interfered with. The mine is just now, to my mind, the safest place for anybody at all compromised. I only wish the railway was as difficult to touch." "Am I compromised?" Dr. Monygham brought out slowly, after a short silence. "The whole Gould concession is compromised. It could not have remained for ever outside the political life of the country, if those convulsions may be called life. The thing is, can it be touched? The moment was bound to come when neutrality would become impossible, and Charles Gould understood this well. I believe he is prepared for every extremity. A man of his sort has never contemplated remaining indefinitely at the mercy of ignorance and corruption. It was like being a prisoner in a cavern of banditti with the price of your ransom in your pocket, and buying your life from day to day. Your mere safety, not your liberty, mind, doctor. I know what I am talking about. The image at which you shrug your shoulders is perfectly correct, especially if you conceive such a prisoner endowed with the power of replenishing his pocket by means as remote from the faculties of his captors as if they were magic. You must have understood that as well as I do, doctor. He was in the position of the goose with the golden eggs. I broached the matter to him as far back as Sir John's visit here. The prisoner of stupid and greedy banditti is always at the mercy of the first imbecile ruffian who may blow out his brains in a fit of temper or for some prospect of an immediate big haul. The tale of killing the goose with the golden eggs has not been evolved for nothing out of the wisdom of mankind. It is a story that will never grow old. That is why Charles Gould in his deep, dumb way has countenanced the Ribierist mandate, the first public act that promised him safety on other than venal grounds. Ribierism has failed, as everything merely rational fails in this country. But Gould remains logical in wishing to save this big lot of silver. Decoud's plan of a counter-revolution may be practicable or not. It may have a chance, or it may not have a chance. With all my experience of this revolutionary continent, I can hardly yet look at their methods seriously. Decoud has been reading to us his draft of a proclamation, and talking very well for 2 hours about his plan of action. He had arguments which should have appeared solid enough, if we, members of old stable political and national organizations, were not startled by the mere idea of a new state evolved like this out of the head of a scoffing young man fleeing for his life, with a proclamation in his pocket to a rough, jeering, half-bred swashbuckler, who in this part of the world is called a general. It sounds like a comic fairy tale, and behold, it may come off, because it is true to the very spirit of the country. "Is the silver gone off, then?" asked the doctor, moodily. The chief engineer pulled out his watch. "By Captain Mitchell's reckoning, and he ought to know, it has been gone long enough now to be some 3 or 4 miles outside the harbor. And, as Mitchell says, Nostromo is the sort of seaman to make the best of his opportunities." Here the doctor grunted so heavily that the other changed his tone. "You have a poor opinion of that move, doctor. But why? Charles Gould has got to play his game out, though he is not the man to formulate his conduct even to himself, perhaps. Let alone to others, it may be that the game has been partly suggested to him by Holroyd, but it accords with his character too, and that is why it has been so successful. Haven't they come to calling him El Rey de Sulaco in Santa Marta? A nickname may be the best record of a success. That's what I call putting the face of a joke upon the body of a truth. My dear sir, when I first arrived in Santa Marta, I was struck by the way all these journalists, demagogues, members of Congress, and all those generals and judges cringed before a sleepy-eyed advocate without practice, simply because he was the plenipotentiary of the Gould concession. Sir John, when he came out, was impressed too. A new state, with that plump dandy Decoud for the first president," mused Dr. Monygham, nursing his cheek and swinging his legs all the time. "Upon my word, why not?" the chief engineer retorted in an unexpected, earnest, and confidential voice. It was as if something subtle in the air of Costaguana had inoculated him with the local faith in pronunciamientos. All at once he began to talk, like an expert revolutionist, of the instrument ready to hand in the intact army at Ceuta, which could be brought back in a few days to Sulaco if only Decoud managed to make his way at once down the coast. For the military chief there was Barrios, who had nothing but a bullet to expect from Montero, his former professional rival and bitter enemy. Barrios' concurrence was assured. As to his army, it had nothing to expect from Montero either, not even a month's pay. From that point of view, the existence of the treasure was of enormous importance. The mere knowledge that it had been saved from the Monterists would be a strong inducement for the Ceuta troops to embrace the cause of the new state. The doctor turned round and contemplated his companion for some time. "This Decoud, I see, is a persuasive young beggar," he remarked at last. "And pray is it for this, then, that Charles Gould has let the whole lot of ingots go out to sea in charge of that Nostromo?" "Charles Gould," said the engineer-in-chief, "has said no more about his motive than usual. You know he doesn't talk, but we all here know his motive, and he has only one: the safety of the San Tome mine, with the preservation of the Gould concession, in the spirit of his compact with Holroyd. Holroyd is another uncommon man. They understand each other's imaginative side. One is 30, the other nearly 60, and they have been made for each other. To be a millionaire, and such a millionaire as Holroyd, is like being eternally young. The audacity of youth reckons upon it what it fancies an unlimited time at its disposal, but a millionaire has unlimited means in his hand, which is better. One's time on earth is an uncertain quantity, but about the long reach of millions there is no doubt. The introduction of a pure form of Christianity into this continent is a dream for a youthful enthusiast, and I have been trying to explain to you why Holroyd, at 58, is like a man on the threshold of life, and better too. He's not a missionary, but the San Tome mine holds just that for him. I assure you, in sober truth, that he could not manage to keep this out of a strictly business conference upon the finances of Costaguana he had with Sir John a couple of years ago. Sir John mentioned it with amazement in a letter he wrote to me here, from San Francisco, when on his way home. Upon my word, doctor, things seem to be worth nothing by what they are in themselves. I begin to believe that the only solid thing about them is the spiritual value which everyone discovers in his own form of activity." "Bah!" interrupted the doctor, without stopping for an instant the idle swinging movement of his legs. "Self-flattery, food for that vanity which makes the world go round. Meantime, what do you think is going to happen to the treasure floating about the Gulf with the great capataz and the great politician?" "Why are you uneasy about it, doctor?" "I uneasy? And what the devil is it to me? I put no spiritual value into my desires, or my opinions, or my actions. They have not enough vastness to give me room for self-flattery. Look, for instance, I should certainly have liked to ease the last moments of that poor woman. And I can't. It's impossible. Have you met the impossible face to face? Or have you, the Napoleon of railways, no such word in your dictionary?" "Is she bound to have a very bad time of it?" asked the chief engineer, with humane concern. Slow, heavy footsteps moved across the planks above the heavy hard wood beams of the kitchen. Then down the narrow opening of the staircase made in the thickness of the wall, and narrow enough to be defended by one man against 20 enemies, came the murmur of two voices, one faint and broken, the other deep and gentle answering it, and in its graver tone covering the weaker sound. The two men remained still and silent till the murmurs ceased. Then the doctor shrugged his shoulders and muttered, "Yes, she's bound to, and I could do nothing if I went up now." A long period of silence above and below ensued. "I fancy," began the engineer, in a subdued voice, "that you mistrust Captain Mitchell's capataz." "Mistrust him!" muttered the doctor through his teeth. "I believe him capable of anything, even of the most absurd fidelity. I am the last person he spoke to before he left the wharf, you know. The poor woman up there wanted to see him, and I let him go up to her. The dying must not be contradicted, you know. She seemed then fairly calm and resigned, but the scoundrel in those 10 minutes or so has done or said something which seems to have driven her into despair. You know," went on the doctor, hesitatingly, "women are so very unaccountable in every position, and at all times of life, that I thought sometimes she was in a way, don't you see, in love with him, the capataz. The rascal has his own charms indubitably, or he would not have made the conquest of all the populace of the town. No, no, I am not absurd. I may have given a wrong name to some strong sentiment for him on her part, to an unreasonable and simple attitude a woman is apt to take up emotionally towards a man. She used to abuse him to me frequently, which, of course, is not inconsistent with my idea. Not at all. It looked to me as if she were always thinking of him. He was something important in her life. You know, I have seen a lot of those people. Whenever I came down from the mine, Mrs. Gould used to ask me to keep my eye on them. She likes Italians. She has lived a long time in Italy, I believe, and she took a special fancy to that old Garibaldino. A remarkable chap enough. A rugged and dreamy character, living in the republicanism of his young days, as if in a cloud. He has encouraged much of the capataz's confounded nonsense. The high-strung, exalted old beggar." "What sort of nonsense?" wondered the chief engineer. "I found the capataz always a very shrewd and sensible fellow, absolutely fearless, and remarkably useful. A perfect handy man. Sir John was greatly impressed by his resourcefulness and attention when he made that overland journey from Sta. Marta. Later on, as you might have heard, he rendered us a service by disclosing to the then chief of police the presence in the town of some professional thieves, who came from a distance to wreck and rob our monthly pay train. He has certainly organized the lighterage service of the harbor for the O.S.N. Company with great ability. He knows how to make himself obeyed, foreigner though he is. It is true that the cargadores are strangers here, too, for the most part, immigrants, Islenos. His prestige is his fortune." muttered the doctor, sourly. The man has proved his trustworthiness up to the hilt on innumerable occasions, and in all sorts of ways, argued the engineer. When this question of the silver arose, Captain Mitchell naturally was very warmly of the opinion that his capataz was the only man fit for the trust. As a sailor, of course, I suppose so, but as a man, don't you know, Gould, Decoud, and myself judged that it didn't matter in the least who went. Any boatman would have done just as well. Pray, what could a thief do with such a lot of ingots? If he ran off with them, he would have in the end to land somewhere, and how could he conceal his cargo from the knowledge of the people ashore? We dismissed that consideration from our minds. Moreover, Decoud was going. There have been occasions when the capataz has been more implicitly trusted. He took a slightly different view, the doctor said. I heard him declare in this very room that it would be the most desperate affair of his life. He made a sort of verbal will here in my hearing, appointing old Viola as his executor. And, by Jove, do you know he has not grown rich by his fidelity to you, good people of the railway and the harbour. I suppose he obtains some. How do you say that? Some spiritual value for his labours, or else I don't know why the devil he should be faithful to you, Gould, Mitchell, or anybody else. He knows this country well. He knows, for instance, that Gamacho, the deputy from Javira, has been nothing else but a tramposo of the commonest sort, a petty peddler of the Campo, till he managed to get enough goods on credit from Anzani to open a little store in the wilds, and got himself elected by the drunken mozos that hang about the estancias and the poor sort of rancheros who are in his debt. And Gamacho, who tomorrow will be probably one of our high officials, is a stranger too, an Isleno. He might have been a cargador on the OSN wharf had he not, the posadero of Rincon is ready to swear it, murdered a peddler in the woods and stolen his pack to begin life on. And do you think that Gamacho, then, would have ever become a hero with the democracy of this place, like our capataz? Of course not. He isn't half the man. No, decidedly, I think that Nostromo is a fool. The doctor's talk was distasteful to the builder of railways. It is impossible to argue that point, he said philosophically. Each man has his gifts. You should have heard Gamacho haranguing his friends in the street. He has a howling voice, and he shouted like mad, lifting his clenched fist right above his head, and throwing his body half out of the window. At every pause the rabble below yelled, "Down with the oligarchs! Viva la libertad!" Fuentes, inside, looked extremely miserable. You know, he is the brother of Jorge Fuentes, who has been Minister of the Interior for 6 months or so, some years back. Of course, he has no conscience, but he is a man of birth and education. At one time the director of the customs of Ceuta. That idiot brute, Gamacho, fastened himself upon him with his following of the lowest rabble. His sickly fear of that ruffian was the most rejoicing sight imaginable. He got up and went to the door to look out towards the harbour. All quiet, he said. I wonder if Sotillo really means to turn up here. End of Part 3, Chapter 1.
Chapter 2 of Nostromo. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Bologna Times. Nostromo by Joseph Conrad. Part 3, The Lighthouse. Chapter 2. Captain Mitchell, pacing the wharf, was asking himself the same question. There was always the doubt whether the warning of the Esmeralda telegraphist, a fragmentary and interrupted message, had been properly understood. However, the good man had made up his mind not to go to bed till daylight, if even then. He imagined himself to have rendered an enormous service to Charles Gould. When he thought of the saved silver, he rubbed his hands together with satisfaction. In his simple way, he was proud at being a party to this extremely clever expedient. It was he who had given it a practical shape by suggesting the possibility of intercepting at sea the northbound steamer. And it was advantageous to his company, too, which would have lost a valuable freight if the treasure had been left ashore to be confiscated. The pleasure of disappointing the Monterists was also very great. Authoritative by temperament and the long habit of command, Captain Mitchell was no democrat. He even went so far as to profess a contempt for parliamentarism itself. His Excellency Don Vincente Ribiera, he used to say, whom I and that fellow of mine, Nostromo, had the honor, sir, and the pleasure of saving from a cruel death, deferred too much to his Congress. It was a mistake, a distinct mistake, sir. The guileless old seaman superintending the OSN service imagined that the last 3 days had exhausted every startling surprise the political life of Costaguana could offer. He used to confess afterwards that the events which followed surpassed his imagination. To begin with, Sulaco, because of the seizure of the cables and the disorganization of the steam service, remained for a whole fortnight cut off from the rest of the world like a besieged city. One would not have believed it possible, but so it was, sir, a full fortnight. The account of the extraordinary things that happened during that time, and the powerful emotions he experienced, acquired a comic impressiveness from the pompous manner of his personal narrative. He opened it always by assuring his hearer that he was in the thick of things from first to last. Then he would begin by describing the getting away of the silver, and his natural anxiety lest his fellow in charge of the lighter should make some mistake. Apart from the loss of so much precious metal, the life of Señor Martin de Cole, an agreeable, wealthy, and well-informed young gentleman, would have been jeopardized through his falling into the hands of his political enemies. Captain Mitchell also admitted that in his solitary vigil on the wharf he had felt a certain measure of concern for the future of the whole country. A feeling, sir, he explained, perfectly comprehensible in a man properly grateful for the many kindnesses received from the best families of merchants and other native gentlemen of independent means, who, barely saved by us from the excesses of the mob, seemed, to my mind's eye, destined to become the prey in person and fortune of the native soldiery, which, as is well known, behave with regrettable barbarity to the inhabitants during their civil commotion. And then, sir, there were the Goulds, for both of whom, man and wife, I could not but entertain the warmest feelings deserved by their hospitality and kindness. I felt, too, the dangers of the gentlemen of the Amarilla Club, who had made me honorary member, and had treated me with uniform regard and civility, both in my capacity of consular agent and as superintendent of an important steam service. Miss Antonio Avellanos, the most beautiful and accomplished young lady whom it had ever been my privilege to speak to, was not a little in my mind, I confess. How the interests of my company would be affected by the impending change of officials claimed a large share of my attention, too. In short, sir, I was extremely anxious and very tired, as you may suppose, by the exciting and memorable events in which I had taken my little part. The company's building, containing my residence, was within 5 minutes' walk, with the attraction of some supper and of my hammock. I always take my nightly rest in a hammock, as the most suitable to the climate. But somehow, sir, though evidently I could do nothing for anyone by remaining about, I could not tear myself away from that wharf, where the fatigue made me stumble painfully at times. The night was excessively dark, the darkest I remember in my life, so that I began to think that the arrival of the transport from Esmeralda could not possibly take place before daylight, owing to the difficulty of navigating the Gulf. The mosquitoes bit like fury. We have been infested here with mosquitoes before the late improvements, a peculiar harbor brand, sir, renowned for its ferocity. They were like a cloud about my head, and I shouldn't wonder that but for the attacks I would have dozed off as I walked up and down and got a heavy fall. I kept on smoking cigar after cigar, more to protect myself from being eaten up alive than from any real relish for the weed. Then, sir, when perhaps for the 20th time I was approaching my watch to the lighted end in order to see the time, and observing with surprise that it wanted yet 10 minutes to midnight, I heard the splash of a ship's propeller, an unmistakable sound to a sailor's ear on such a calm night. It was faint indeed, because they were advancing with precaution and dead slow, both on account of the darkness and from their desire of not revealing too soon their presence, a very unnecessary care, because I verily believe, in all the enormous extent of this harbour, I was the only living soul about. Even the usual staff of watchmen and others had been absent from their post for several nights owing to the disturbances. I stood stock still, after dropping and stamping out my cigar, a circumstance highly agreeable, I should think, to the mosquitoes, if I may judge from the state of my face next morning. But that was a trifling inconvenience in comparison with the brutal proceedings I became victim of on the part of Sotillo. Something utterly inconceivable, sir, more like the proceedings of a maniac than the action of a sane man, however lost to all sense of honour and decency. But Sotillo was furious at the failure of his thievish scheme. In this Captain Mitchell was right. Sotillo was indeed infuriated. Captain Mitchell, however, had not been arrested at once. A vivid curiosity induced him to remain on the wharf, which is nearly 400 feet long, to see, or rather hear, the whole process of disembarkation. Concealed by the railway truck used for the silver which had been run back afterwards to the shore end of the jetty, Captain Mitchell saw the small detachment thrown forward pass by, taking different directions upon the plain. Meantime the troops were being landed and formed into a column, whose head crept up gradually so close to him that he made it out, barring nearly the whole width of the wharf, only a very few yards from him. Then the low, shuffling, murmuring, clinking sound ceased, and the whole mass remained for about an hour motionless and silent, awaiting the return of the scouts. On land nothing was to be heard except the deep baying of the mastiffs at the railway yards, answered by the faint barking of the curs infesting the outer limits of the town. A detached knot of dark shapes stood in front of the head of the column. Presently the picket at the end of the wharf began to challenge in undertones single figures approaching from the plain. Those messengers sent back from the scouting parties flung to their comrades brief sentences, and passed on rapidly, becoming lost in the great motionless mass, to make their report to the staff. It occurred to Captain Mitchell that his position could become disagreeable and perhaps dangerous, when suddenly, at the head of the jetty, there was a shout of command, a bugle call, followed by a stir and a rattling of arms, and a murmuring noise that ran right up the column. Near by, a loud voice directed hurriedly, "Push that railway car out of the way." At the rush of bare feet to execute the order, Captain Mitchell skipped back a pace or two. The car, suddenly impelled by many hands, flew away from him along the rails, and before he knew what had happened, he found himself surrounded and seized by his arms and the collar of his coat. "We have caught a man hiding here, mi teniente," cried one of his captors. "Hold him on one side till the rear guard comes along," answered the voice. The whole column streamed past Captain Mitchell at a run, the thundering noise of their feet dying away suddenly on the shore. His captors held him tightly, disregarding his declaration that he was an Englishman, and his loud demands to be taken at once before their commanding officer. Finally he lapsed into dignified silence. With a hollow rumble of wheels on the planks, a couple of field guns, dragged by hand, rolled by. Then, after a small body of men had marched past, escorting 4 or 5 figures which walked in advance, with a jingle of steel scabbards, he felt a tug at his arms, and was ordered to come along. During the passage from the wharf to the custom-house, it is to be feared that Captain Mitchell was subjected to certain indignities at the hands of the soldiers, such as jerks, thumps on the neck, forcible application of the butt of a rifle to the small of his back, Their ideas of speed were not in accord with his notion of dignity. He became flustered, flushed, and helpless. It was as if the world were coming to an end. The long building was surrounded by troops, which were already piling arms by companies and preparing to pass the night lying on the ground in their ponchos with their sacks under their heads. Corporals moved with swinging lanterns, posting sentries all round the walls wherever there was a door or an opening. Sotillo was taking his measures to protect his conquest as if it had indeed contained the treasure. His desire to make his fortune at one audacious stroke of genius had overmastered his reasoning faculties. He would not believe in the possibility of failure. The mere hint of such a thing made his brain reel with rage. Every circumstance pointing to it appeared incredible. The statement of Hirsch, which was so absolutely fatal to his hopes, could by no means be admitted. It is true, too, that Hirsch's story had been told so incoherently, with such excessive signs of distraction, that it really looked improbable. It was extremely difficult, as the saying is, to make head or tail of it. On the bridge of the steamer, directly after his rescue, Sotillo and his officers, in their impatience and excitement, would not give the wretched man time to collect such few wits as remained to him. He ought to have been quieted, soothed, and reassured, whereas he had been roughly handled, cuffed, shaken, and addressed in menacing tones. His struggles, his wriggles, his attempts to get down on his knees, followed by the most violent efforts to break away, as if he meant incontinently to jump overboard. His shrieks and shrinkings and cowering wild glances had filled them first with amazement, then with a doubt of his genuineness, as men are wont to suspect the sincerity of every great passion. His Spanish, too, became so mixed up with German that the better half of his statements remained incomprehensible. He tried to propitiate them by calling them Hochwohlgeboren Herren, which in itself sounded suspicious. When admonished sternly not to trifle, he repeated his entreaties and protestations of loyalty and innocence again in German, obstinately, because he was not aware in what language he was speaking. His identity, of course, was perfectly known as an inhabitant of Esmeralda, but this made the matter no clearer. As he kept on forgetting Decoud's name, mixing him up with several other people he had seen in the Casa Gould, it looked as if they all had been in the lighter together, and for a moment Sotillo thought that he had drowned every prominent Ribierist of Sulaco. The improbability of such a thing threw a doubt upon the whole statement. Hirsch was either mad or playing a part, pretending fear and distraction on the spur of the moment to cover the truth. Sotillo's rapacity, excited to the highest pitch by the prospect of an immense booty, could believe in nothing adverse. This Jew might have been very much frightened by the accident, but he knew where the silver was concealed, and had invented this story, with his Jewish cunning, to put him entirely off the track as to what had been done. Sotillo had taken up his quarters on the upper floor in a vast apartment with heavy black beams, but there was no ceiling, and the eye lost itself in the darkness under the high pitch of the roof. The thick shutters stood open. On a long table could be seen a large inkstand, some stumpy, inky quill pens, and two square wooden boxes, each holding half a hundredweight of sand. Sheets of gray, coarse, official paper bestrewed the floor. It must have been a room occupied by some higher official of the customs, because a large leathern armchair stood behind the table, with other high-backed chairs scattered about. A net hammock was swung under one of the beams, for the official's afternoon siesta, no doubt. A couple of candles, stuck into tall iron candlesticks, gave a dim reddish light. The colonel's hat, sword, and revolver lay between them, and a couple of his more trusty officers lounged gloomily against the table. The colonel threw himself into the armchair, and a big negro with a sergeant's stripes on his ragged sleeve, kneeling down, pulled off his boots. Sotillo's ebony moustache contrasted violently with the livid coloring of his cheeks. His eyes were sombre, and as if sunk very far into his head. He seemed exhausted by his perplexities, languid with disappointment, but when the sentry on the landing thrust his head in to announce the arrival of a prisoner, he revived at once. "Let him be brought in," he shouted fiercely. The door flew open, and Captain Mitchell, bareheaded, his waistcoat open, the bow of his tie under his ear, was hustled into the room. Sotillo recognized him at once. He could not have hoped for a more precious capture. Here was a man who could tell him, if he chose, everything he wished to know, and directly the problem of how best to make him talk to the point presented itself to his mind. The resentment of a foreign nation had no terrors for Sotillo. The might of the whole armed Europe would not have protected Captain Mitchell from insults and ill usage so well as the quick reflection of Sotillo that this was an Englishman who would most likely turn obstinate under bad treatment and become quite unmanageable. At all events, the colonel smoothed the scowl on his brow. "What! The excellent Señor Mitchell!" he cried, in affected dismay. The pretended anger of his swift advance and of his shout, "Release the caballero at once!" was so effective that the astounded soldiers positively sprang away from their prisoner. Thus suddenly deprived of forcible support, Captain Mitchell reeled as though about to fall. Sotillo took him familiarly under the arm, led him to a chair, waved his hand at the room. "Go out, all of you," he commanded. When they had been left alone, he stood looking down, irresolute and silent, watching till Captain Mitchell had recovered his power of speech. Here in his very grasp was one of the men concerned in the removal of the silver. Sotillo's temperament was of that sort that he experienced an ardent desire to beat him. Just as formerly, when negotiating with difficulty a loan from the cautious Anzani, his fingers always itched to take the shopkeeper by the throat. As to Captain Mitchell, the suddenness, unexpectedness, and general inconceivableness of this experience had confused his thoughts. Moreover, he was physically out of breath. "I've been knocked down 3 times between this and the wharf," he gasped out at last. "Somebody shall be made to pay for this." He had certainly stumbled more than once, and had been dragged along for some distance before he could regain his stride. With his recovered breath, his indignation seemed to madden him. He jumped up, crimson, all his white hair bristling, his eyes glaring vengefully, and shook violently the flaps of his ruined waistcoat before the disconcerted Sotillo. "Look, those uniformed thieves of yours downstairs have robbed me of my watch." The old sailor's aspect was very threatening. Sotillo saw himself cut off from the table on which his saber and revolver were lying. "I demand restitution and apologies," Mitchell thundered at him, quite beside himself. "From you! Yes, from you!" For the space of a second or so the colonel stood with a perfectly stony expression of face. Then, as Captain Mitchell flung out an arm towards the table as if to snatch up the revolver, Sotillo, with a yell of alarm, bounded to the door and was gone in a flash, slamming it after him. Surprise calmed Captain Mitchell's fury. Behind the closed door Sotillo shouted on the landing, and there was a great tumult of feet on the wooden staircase. "Disarm him! Bind him!" the colonel could be heard vociferating. Captain Mitchell had just the time to glance once at the windows, with 3 perpendicular bars of iron each, and some 20 feet from the ground, as he well knew, before the door flew open and the rush upon him took place. In an incredibly short time he found himself bound with many turns of a hide rope to a high-backed chair, so that his head alone remained free. Not till then did Sotillo, who had been leaning in the doorway trembling visibly, venture again within. The soldiers, picking up from the floor the rifles they had dropped to grapple with the prisoner, filed out of the room. The officers remained, leaning on their swords and looking on. "The watch! The watch!" raved the colonel, pacing to and fro like a tiger in a cage. "Give me that man's watch." It was true that when searched for arms in the hall downstairs, before being taken into Sotillo's presence, Captain Mitchell had been relieved of his watch and chain. But at the colonel's clamor it was produced quickly enough, a corporal bringing it up. carried carefully in the palms of his joined hands. Sotillo snatched it and pushed the clenched fist from which it dangled close to Captain Mitchell's face. "Now then, you arrogant Englishman, you dare to call the soldiers of the army thieves? Behold your watch!" He flourished his fist as if aiming blows at the prisoner's nose. Captain Mitchell, helpless as a swathed infant, looked anxiously at the 60-guinea gold half-chronometer presented to him years ago by a committee of underwriters for saving a ship from total loss by fire. Sotillo, too, seemed to perceive its valuable appearance. He became silent suddenly, stepped aside to the table, and began a careful examination in the light of the candles. He had never seen anything so fine. His officers closed in and craned their necks behind his back. He became so interested that for an instant he forgot his precious prisoner. There is always something childish in the rapacity of the passionate, clear-minded southern races, wanting in the misty idealism of the northerners, who, at the smallest encouragement, dream of nothing less than the conquest of the earth. Sotillo was fond of jewels, gold trinkets, of personal adornment. After a moment he turned about, and with a commanding gesture made all of his officers fall back. He laid down the watch on the table, then, negligently, pushed his hat over it. "Ha!" he began, going up very close to the chair. "You dare call my valiant soldiers of the Esmeralda regiment thieves? You dare! What impudence! You foreigners come here to rob our country of its wealth. You never have enough. Your audacity knows no bounds." He looked towards the officers, amongst whom there was an approving murmur. The older major was moved to declare, "See, mi colonel, they are all traitors." "I shall say nothing," continued Sotillo, fixing the motionless and powerless Mitchell with an angry but an easy stare. "I shall say nothing of your treacherous attempt to get possession of my revolver, to shoot me while I was trying to treat you with consideration you did not deserve. You have forfeited your life. Your only hope is in my clemency." He watched for the effect of his words, but there was no obvious sign of fear on Captain Mitchell's face. His white hair was full of dust, which covered also the rest of his helpless person. As if he had heard nothing, he twitched an eyebrow to get rid of a bit of straw which hung amongst the hairs. Sotillo advanced one leg and put his arms akimbo. "It is you, Mitchell," he said emphatically, "who are the thief, not my soldiers." He pointed at his prisoner a forefinger with a long, almond-shaped nail. "Where is the silver of the San Tome mine? I ask you, Mitchell, where is the silver that was deposited in this custom-house? Answer me that. You stole it. You were a party to stealing it. It was stolen from the government. Aha! You think I do not know what I say, but I am up to your foreign tricks. It is gone, the silver, no? Gone in one of your lunches, you miserable man. How dared you?" This time he produced his effect. How on earth could Sotillo know that? Thought Mitchell. His head, the only part of his body that could move, betrayed his surprise by a sudden jerk. "Ha! You tremble!" Sotillo shouted suddenly. "It is a conspiracy. It is a crime against the state. Did you not know that the silver belongs to the Republic till the government claims are satisfied? Where is it? Where have you hidden it, you miserable thief?" At this question, Captain Mitchell's sinking spirits revived. In whatever incomprehensible manner Sotillo had already got his information about the lighter, he had not captured it. That was clear. In his outraged heart, Captain Mitchell had resolved that nothing would induce him to say a word while he remained so disgracefully bound. But his desire to help the escape of the silver made him depart from its resolution. His wits were very much at work. He detected in Sotillo a certain air of doubt, of irresolution. "That man," he said to himself, "is not certain of what he advances." For all his pomposity in social intercourse, Captain Mitchell could meet the realities of life in a resolute and ready spirit. Now he had got over the first shock of the abominable treatment, he was cool and collected enough. The immense contempt he felt for Sotillo steadied him, and he said oracularly, "No doubt it is very well concealed by this time." Sotillo, too, had time to cool down. "Muy bien, Mitchell," he said in a cold and threatening manner, "but can you produce the government receipt for the royalty and the custom house permit of embarkation, hey? Can you? No. Then the silver has been removed illegally, and the guilty shall be made to suffer, unless it is produced within 5 days from this. He gave orders for the prisoner to be unbound and locked up in one of the smaller rooms downstairs. He walked about the room, moody and silent, till Captain Mitchell, with each of his arms held by a couple of men, stood up, shook himself, and stamped his feet. "How did you like to be tied up, Mitchell?" he asked derisively. "It is the most incredible, abominable use of power," Captain Mitchell declared in a loud voice, "and whatever your purpose, you shall gain nothing from it, I can promise you." The tall colonel, livid, with his coal-black ringlets and moustache, crouched, as it were, to look into the eyes of the short, thick-set, red-faced prisoner with rumpled white hair. "That we shall see. You shall know my power a little better when I tie you up to a potelon outside in the sun for a whole day." He drew himself up haughtily, and made a sign for Captain Mitchell to be led away. "What about my watch?" cried Captain Mitchell, hanging back from the efforts of the men pulling him towards the door. Sotillo turned to his officers. "No, but only listen to this picaro, caballeros," he pronounced with affected scorn, and was answered by a chorus of derisive laughter. "He demands his watch." He ran up again to Captain Mitchell, for the desire to relieve his feelings by inflicting blows and pain upon this Englishman was very strong within him. "Your watch? You are a prisoner in wartime, Mitchell. In wartime! You have no rights and no property. Caramba! The very breath in your body belongs to me. Remember that." "Bosh!" said Captain Mitchell, concealing a disagreeable impression. Down below, in a great hall, with the earthen floor and with a tall mound thrown up by white ants in a corner, the soldiers had kindled a small fire with broken chairs and tables near the arched gateway, through which the faint murmur of the harbor waters on the beach could be heard. While Captain Mitchell was being led down the staircase, an officer passed him, running up to report to Sotillo the capture of more prisoners. A lot of smoke hung about in the vast gloomy place. The fire crackled, and, as if through a haze, Captain Mitchell made out, surrounded by short soldiers with fixed bayonets, the heads of 3 tall prisoners, the doctor, the engineer-in-chief, and the white leonine mane of old Viola, who stood half-turned away from the others with his chin on his breast and his arms crossed. Mitchell's astonishment knew no bounds. He cried out. The other 2 exclaimed also. But he hurried on, diagonally, across the big, cavern-like hall. Lots of thoughts, surmises, hints of caution, and so on, crowded his head to distraction. "Is he actually keeping you?" shouted the chief engineer, whose single eyeglass glittered in the firelight. An officer from the top of the stairs was shouting urgently, "Bring them all up, all 3!" In the clamor of voices and the rattle of arms, Captain Mitchell made himself heard imperfectly. "By heavens! The fellow has stolen my watch!" The engineer-in-chief on the staircase resisted the pressure long enough to shout, "What? What did you say?" "My chronometer!" Captain Mitchell yelled violently at the very moment of being thrust head foremost through a small door into a sort of cell, perfectly black and so narrow that he fetched up against the opposite wall. The door had been instantly slammed. He knew where they had put him. This was the strong room of the custom house, whence the silver had been removed only a few hours earlier. It was almost as narrow as a corridor, with a small square aperture, barred by a heavy grating at the distant end. Captain Mitchell staggered for a few steps, then sat down on the earthen floor with his back to the wall. Nothing, not even a gleam of light from anywhere, interfered with Captain Mitchell's meditation. He did some hard but not very extensive thinking. It was not of a gloomy cast. The old sailor, with all his small weaknesses and absurdities, was constitutionally incapable of entertaining for any length of time a fear of his personal safety. It was not so much firmness of soul as the lack of a certain kind of imagination, the kind whose undue development caused intense suffering to Señor Hirsch, that sort of imagination which adds the blind terror of bodily suffering and of death, envisaged as an accident to the body alone, strictly, to all the other apprehensions on which the sense of one's existence is based. Unfortunately, Captain Mitchell had not much penetration of any kind. Characteristic, illuminating trifles of expression, action, or movement escaped him completely. He was too pompously and innocently aware of his own existence to observe that of others. For instance, he could not believe that Sotillo had been really afraid of him, and this simply because it would never have entered into his head to shoot anyone except in the most pressing case of self-defense. Anybody could see he was not a murdering kind of man, he reflected quite gravely. Then why this preposterous and insulting charge? He asked himself. But his thoughts mainly clung around the astounding and unanswerable question, how the devil the fellow got to know that the silver had gone off in the lighter. It was obvious that he had not captured it, and obviously he could not have captured it. In this last conclusion, Captain Mitchell was misled by the assumption drawn from his observation of the weather during his long vigil on the wharf. He thought that there had been much more wind than usual that night in the Gulf, whereas, as a matter of fact, the reverse was the case. How in the name of all that's marvelous did that confounded fellow get wind of the affair? Was the first question he asked directly after the bang, clatter, and flash of the open door, which was closed again almost before he could lift his dropped head, informed him that he had a companion of captivity. Dr. Monygham's voice stopped muttering curses in English and Spanish. "Is that you, Mitchell?" he made answer, surlily. I struck my forehead against this confounded wall with enough force to fell an ox. "Where are you?" Captain Mitchell, accustomed to the darkness, could make out the doctor stretching out his hands blindly. "I am sitting here on the floor. Don't fall over my legs," Captain Mitchell's voice announced with great dignity of tone. The doctor, entreated not to walk about in the dark, sank down to the ground too. The two prisoners of Sotillo, with their heads nearly touching, began to exchange confidences. "Yes," the doctor related in a low tone to Captain Mitchell's vehement curiosity, "we have been nabbed in old Viola's place. It seems that one of their pickets, commanded by an officer, pushed as far as the town gate. They had orders not to enter, but to bring along every soul they could find on the plain. We had been talking in there with the door open, and no doubt they saw the glimmer of our light. They must have been making their approaches for some time. The engineer laid himself on a bench in a recess by the fireplace, and I went upstairs to have a look. I hadn't heard any sound from there in a long time. Old Viola, as soon as he saw me come up, lifted his arm for silence. I stole in on tiptoe. By Jove, his wife was lying down and had gone to sleep. The woman had actually dropped off to sleep. "Senor Doctor," Viola whispers to me, "it looks as if her oppression was going to get better." "Yes," I said, very much surprised. "Your wife is a wonderful woman, Giorgio." Just then a shot was fired in the kitchen, which made us jump and cower as if at a thunderclap. It seems that the party of soldiers had stolen quite close up, and one of them had crept up to the door. He looked in, thought that there was no one there, and, holding his rifle ready, entered quietly. The chief told me that he had just closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, he saw the man already in the middle of the room, peering into the dark corners. The chief was so startled that, without thinking, he made one leap from the recess, right out in front of the fireplace. The soldier, no less startled, up with his rifle and pulls the trigger, deafening and singeing the engineer, but in his flurry, missing him completely. But look what happens. At the noise of the report, the sleeping woman sat up, as if moved by a spring, with a shriek. "The children, Gian Battista! Save the children!" I have it in my ears now. It was the truest cry of distress I have ever heard. I stood as if paralyzed, but the old husband ran across the bedside, stretching out his hands. She clung to them. I could see her eyes so glazed. The old fellow lowered her down on the pillows and then looked around at me. She was dead. All this took less than 5 minutes. And then I ran down to see what was the matter. It was no use thinking of any resistance. Nothing we two could say availed with the officer, so I volunteered to go up with a couple of soldiers and fetch down old Viola. He was sitting at the foot of the bed, looking at his wife's face, and did not seem to hear what I said. But after I had pulled the sheet over her head, he got up and followed us downstairs quietly, in a sort of thoughtful way. They marched us off along the road, leaving the door open and the candle burning. The chief engineer strode on without a word, but I looked back once or twice at the feeble gleam. After we had gone some considerable distance, the Garibaldino, who was walking by my side, suddenly said, "I have buried many men on battlefields on this continent. The priests talk of consecrated ground. Bah! All the earth made by God is holy. But the sea, which knows nothing of kings and priests and tyrants, is the holiest of all. Doctor, I should like to bury her in the sea. No mummeries, candles, incense, no holy water mumbled over by priests. The spirit of liberty is upon the waters." Amazing old man. He was saying all this in an undertone, as if talking to himself. "Yes, yes," interrupted Captain Mitchell, impatiently. "Poor old chap. But have you any idea how that ruffian Sotillo obtained his information? He did not get hold of any of our cargadores who helped with the truck, did he? But no, it is impossible. These were picked men we've had in our boats for these 5 years, and I paid them myself specially for the job, with instructions to keep out of the way for 24 hours at least. I saw them with my own eyes march on with the Italians to the railway yards. The chief promised to give them rations as long as they wanted to remain there." "Well," said the doctor, slowly, "I can tell you that you may say good-bye forever to your best lighter, and to the capataz of cargadores." At this, Captain Mitchell scrambled up to his feet in the excess of his excitement. The doctor, without giving him time to exclaim, stated briefly the part played by Hirsch during the night. Captain Mitchell was overcome. "Drowned," he muttered, in a bewildered and appalled whisper. "Drowned!" Afterwards he kept still, apparently listening, but too absorbed in the news of the catastrophe to follow the doctor's narrative with attention. The doctor had taken up an attitude of perfect ignorance, till at last Sotillo was induced to have Hirsch brought in to repeat the whole story, which was got out of him again with the greatest difficulty, because every moment he would break out into lamentations. At last Hirsch was led away, looking more dead than alive, and shut up in one of the upstairs rooms to be close at hand. Then the doctor, keeping up his character of a man not admitted to the inner councils of the San Tome administration, remarked that the story sounded incredible. Of course, he said, he couldn't tell what had been the action of the Europeans, as he had been exclusively occupied with his own work in looking after the wounded, and also in attending Don Jose Avellanos. He had succeeded in assuming so well a tone of impartial indifference that Sotillo seemed to be completely deceived. Till then a show of regular inquiry had been kept up. One of the officers sitting at the table wrote down the questions and the answers. The others, lounging about the room, listened attentively, puffing at their long cigars and keeping their eyes on the doctor. But at that point Sotillo ordered everybody out. End of Part 3, Chapter 2.
Chapter 3 of Nostromo. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Nostromo by Joseph Conrad. Part 3rd. The Lighthouse. Chapter 3. Directly they were alone, the colonel's severe official manner changed. He rose and approached the doctor. His eyes shone with rapacity and hope. He became confidential. The silver might have been indeed put on board the lighter, but it was not conceivable that it should have been taken out to sea. The doctor, watching every word, nodded slightly, smoking with apparent relish the cigar which Sotillo had offered him as a sign of his friendly intentions. The doctor's manner of cold detachment from the rest of the Europeans led Sotillo on till, from conjecture to conjecture, he arrived at hinting that in his opinion this was a put-up job on the part of Charles Gould in order to get hold of that immense treasure all to himself. The doctor, observant and self-possessed, muttered, "He is very capable of that." Here Captain Mitchell exclaimed with amazement, amusement, and indignation, "You said that of Charles Gould!" Disgust and even some suspicion crept into his tone, for to him, too, as to other Europeans, there appeared to be something dubious about the doctor's personality. "What on earth made you say that to this watch-stealing scoundrel?" he asked. "What's the object of an infernal lie of that sort? That confounded pickpocket was quite capable of believing you." He snorted. For a time the doctor remained silent in the dark. "Yes, that is exactly what I did say," he uttered at last, in a tone which would have made it clear enough to a third party that the pause was not of a reluctant but of a reflective character. Captain Mitchell thought that he had never heard anything so brazenly impudent in his life. "Well, well," he muttered to himself, but he had not the heart to voice his thoughts. They were swept away by others full of astonishment and regret. A heavy sense of discomfiture crushed him. The loss of the silver, the death of Nostromo, which was really quite a blow to his sensibilities, because he had become attached to his capataz, as people get attached to their inferiors from love of ease and almost unconscious gratitude. And when he thought of Decoud being drowned too, his sensibility was almost overcome by this miserable end. What a heavy blow for that poor young woman! Captain Mitchell did not belong to the species of crabbed old bachelors. On the contrary, he liked to see young men paying attentions to young women. It seemed to him a natural and proper thing. Proper, especially. As to sailors, it was different. It was not their place to marry, he maintained, but it was on moral grounds as a matter of self-denial, for, he explained, life on board ship is not fit for a woman even at best, and if you leave her on shore, first of all it is not fair, and next she either suffers from it or doesn't care a bit, which, in both cases, is bad. He couldn't have told what upset him most: Charles Gould's immense material loss, the death of Nostromo, which was a heavy loss to himself, or the idea of that beautiful and accomplished young woman being plunged into mourning. "Yes," the doctor, who had been apparently reflecting, began again. "He believed me right enough. I thought he would have hugged me. 'See,' he said, 'he will write to that partner of his, the rich Americano in San Francisco, that it is all lost.' Why not? There is enough to share with many people." "But this is perfectly imbecile!" cried Captain Mitchell. The doctor remarked that Sotillo was imbecile, and that his imbecility was ingenious enough to lead him completely astray. He had helped him only but a little way. "I mentioned," the doctor said, "in a sort of casual way, that treasure is generally buried in the earth rather than set afloat upon the sea." At this my Sotillo slapped his forehead. "Por Dios, yes," he said. "They must have buried it on the shores of this harbour somewhere before they sailed out." "Heavens and earth!" muttered Captain Mitchell. "I should not have believed that anybody could be ass enough—" He paused, then went on mournfully. "But what's the good of all this? It would have been a clever enough lie if the lighter had been still afloat. It would have kept that inconceivable idiot perhaps from sending out the steamer to cruise in the Gulf. That was a danger that worried me no end." Captain Mitchell sighed profoundly. "I had an object," the doctor pronounced slowly. "Had you?" muttered Captain Mitchell. "Well, that's lucky, or else I would have thought that you went on fooling him for the fun of the thing. And perhaps that was your object. Well, I must say I personally wouldn't condescend to that sort of thing. It is not to my taste. No, no. Blackening a friend's character is not my idea of fun, if it were to fool the greatest blackguard on earth." Had it not been for Captain Mitchell's depression, caused by the fatal news, his disgust of Dr. Monygham would have taken a more outspoken shape, but he thought to himself that now it really did not matter what that man, whom he had never liked, would say and do. "I wonder," he grumbled, "why they have shut us up together, or why Sotillo should have shut you up at all, since it seems to me you have been fairly chummy up there." "Yes, I wonder," said the doctor grimly. Captain Mitchell's heart was so heavy that he would have preferred for the time being a complete solitude to the best of company, but any company would have been preferable to the doctor's, at whom he had always looked askance as a sort of beachcomber of superior intelligence partly reclaimed from his abased state. That feeling led him to ask, "What has that ruffian done with the other two?" "The chief engineer he would have let go in any case," said the doctor. "He wouldn't like to have a quarrel with the railway upon his hands. Not just yet, at any rate. I don't think, Captain Mitchell, that you understand exactly what Sotillo's position is—" "I don't see why I should bother my head about it," snarled Captain Mitchell. "No," assented the doctor, with the same grim composure. "I don't see why you should. It wouldn't help a single human being in the world if you thought ever so hard upon any subject whatever." "No," said Captain Mitchell, simply, and with evident depression. "A man locked up in a confounded dark hole is not much use to anybody." As to old Viola, the doctor continued, as though he had not heard, Sotillo released him for the same reason he is presently going to release you. Eh? What? Exclaimed Captain Mitchell, staring like an owl in the darkness. What is there in common between me and old Viola? More likely because the old chap has no watch and chain for the pickpocket to steal. And I tell you what, Dr. Monygham, he went on with rising choler, he will find it more difficult than he thinks to get rid of me. He will burn his fingers over that job yet, I can tell you. To begin with, I won't go without my watch, and as to the rest, we shall see. I dare say it is no great matter for you to be locked up, but Joe Mitchell is a different kind of man, sir. I don't mean to submit tamely to insult and robbery. I am a public character, sir. And then Captain Mitchell became aware that the bars of the opening had become visible, a black grating upon a square of grey. The coming of the day silenced Captain Mitchell, as if by the reflection that now in all the future days he would be deprived of the invaluable services of his capataz. He leaned against the wall with his arms folded on his breast, and the doctor walked up and down the whole length of the place with his peculiar hobbling gait, as if slinking about on damaged feet. At the end furthest from the grating he would be lost altogether in the darkness. Only the slight limping shuffle could be heard. There was an air of moody detachment in that painful prowl kept up without a pause. When the door of the prison was suddenly flung open and his name shouted out, he showed no surprise. He swerved sharply in his walk and passed out at once, as though much depended upon his speed. But Captain Mitchell remained for some time with his shoulders against the wall, quite undecided in the bitterness of his spirit whether it wouldn't be better to refuse to stir a limb in the way of protest. He had half a mind to get himself carried out, but after the officer at the door had shouted 3 or 4 times in tones of remonstrance and surprise, he condescended to walk out. Sotillo's manner had changed. The colonel's offhand civility was slightly irresolute, as though he were in doubt if civility were the proper course in this case. He observed Captain Mitchell attentively before he spoke from the big armchair behind the table in a condescending voice. I have concluded not to detain you, Señor Mitchell. I am of a forgiving disposition. I make allowances. Let this be a lesson to you, however. The peculiar dawn of Sulaco, which seems to break far away to the westward and creep back into the shade of the mountains, mingled with the reddish light of the candles. Captain Mitchell, in sign of contempt and indifference, let his eyes roam all over the room, and he gave a hard stare to the doctor, perched already on the casement of one of the windows, with his eyelids lowered, careless and thoughtful, or perhaps ashamed. Sotillo, ensconced in the vast armchair, remarked, I should have thought that the feelings of a caballero would have dictated to you an appropriate reply. He waited for it, but Captain Mitchell remaining mute, more from extreme resentment than from reasoned intention, Sotillo hesitated, glanced towards the doctor, who looked up and nodded, then went on with a slight effort. Here, Señor Mitchell, is your watch. Learn how hasty and unjust has been your judgment of my patriotic soldiers. Lying back in his seat, he extended his arm over the table and pushed the watch away slightly. Captain Mitchell walked up with undisguised eagerness, put it to his ear, then slipped it into his pocket coolly. Sotillo seemed to overcome an immense reluctance. Again he looked aside at the doctor, who stared at him unwinkingly. But as Captain Mitchell was turning away, without as much as a nod or a glance, he hastened to say, You may go and wait downstairs for the Señor Doctor, whom I am going to liberate too. You foreigners are insignificant, to my mind. He forced a slight, discordant laugh out of himself, while Captain Mitchell, for the first time, looked at him with some interest. The law shall take note later on of your transgressions, Sotillo hurried on. But as for me, you can live free, unguarded, unobserved. Do you hear, Señor Mitchell? You may depart to your affairs. You are beneath my notice. My attention is claimed by matters of the very highest importance. Captain Mitchell was very nearly provoked to an answer. It displeased him to be liberated insultingly, but want of sleep, prolonged anxieties, a profound disappointment with the fatal ending of the silver-saving business weighed upon his spirits. It was as much as he could do to conceal his uneasiness, not about himself perhaps, but about things in general. It occurred to him distinctly that something underhand was going on. As he went out he ignored the doctor pointedly. "A brute!" said Sotillo as the door shut. Dr. Monygham slipped off the window-sill and, thrusting his hands into the pockets of the long grey dust-coat he was wearing, made a few steps into the room. Sotillo got up too, and, putting himself in the way, examined him from head to foot. "So your countrymen do not confide in you very much, Señor Doctor. They do not love you, eh? Why is that, I wonder?" The doctor, lifting his head, answered by a long, lifeless stare and the words, "Perhaps because I have lived too long in Costaguana." Sotillo had a gleam of white teeth under the black mustache. "Aha, but you love yourself," he said, encouragingly. "If you leave them alone," the doctor said, looking with the same lifeless stare at Sotillo's handsome face, "they will betray themselves very soon. Meantime, I may try to make Don Carlos speak?" "Ah, Senor Doctor," said Sotillo, wagging his head, "you are a man of quick intelligence. We were made to understand each other." He turned away. He could bear no longer that expressionless and motionless stare, which seemed to have a sort of impenetrable emptiness, like the black depth of an abyss. Even in a man utterly devoid of moral sense there remains an appreciation of rascality which, being conventional, is perfectly clear. Sotillo thought that Dr. Monygham, so different from all Europeans, was ready to sell his countrymen and Charles Gould, his employer, for some share of the San Tome silver. Sotillo did not despise him for that. The colonel's want of moral sense was of a profound and innocent character. It bordered upon stupidity, moral stupidity. Nothing that served his ends could appear to him really reprehensible. Nevertheless, he despised Dr. Monygham. He had for him an immense and satisfactory contempt. He despised him with all his heart because he did not mean to let the doctor have any reward at all. He despised him, not as a man, without faith and honour, but as a fool. Dr. Monygham's insight into his character had deceived Sotillo completely. Therefore he thought the doctor a fool. Since his arrival in Sulaco, the colonel's ideas had undergone some modification. He no longer wished for a political career in Montero's administration. He had always doubted the safety of that course. Since he had learned from the chief engineer that at daylight most likely he would be confronted by Pedro Montero, his misgivings on that point had considerably increased. The guerrillero brother of the general, the Pedrito of popular speech, had a reputation of his own. He wasn't safe to deal with. Sotillo had vaguely planned seizing not only the treasure but the town itself, and then negotiating at leisure. But in the face of facts learned from the chief engineer, who had frankly disclosed to him the whole situation, his audacity, never of a very dashing kind, had been replaced by a most cautious hesitation. An army crossed the mountains under Pedrito already, he had repeated, unable to hide his consternation. If it had not been that I am given the news by a man of your position, I would never have believed it. Astonishing. An armed force, corrected the engineer suavely. His aim was attained. It was to keep Sulaco clear of any armed occupation for a few hours longer, to let those whom fear impelled leave the town. In the general dismay there were families hopeful enough to fly upon the road towards Los Hatos, which was left open by the withdrawal of the armed rabble under Señores Fuentes and Gamacho, to Rincon with their enthusiastic welcome for Pedro Montero. It was a hasty and risky exodus, and it was said that Hernandez, occupying with his band the woods about Los Hatos, was receiving the fugitives. That a good many people he knew were contemplating such a flight had been well known to the chief engineer. Father Corbelan's efforts in the cause of that most pious robber had not been altogether fruitless. The political chief of Sulaco had yielded at the last moment to the urgent entreaties of the priest, had signed a provisional nomination appointing Hernandez a general, and calling upon him officially in this new capacity to preserve order in the town. The fact is that the political chief, seeing the situation desperate, did not care what he signed. It was the last official document he signed before he left the palace of the Intendencia for the refuge of the O.S.N. Company's office. But even had he meant his act to be effective, it was already too late. The riot which he feared and expected broke out in less than an hour after Father Corbelan had left him. Indeed, Father Corbelan, who had appointed a meeting with Nostromo in the Dominican convent, where he had his residence in one of the cells, never managed to reach the place. From the Intendencia he had gone straight on to the Avellanos' house to tell his brother-in-law, and though he stayed there no more than half an hour, he had found himself cut off from his ascetic abode. Nostromo, after waiting there for some time, watching uneasily the increasing uproar in the street, had made his way to the offices of the Porvenir and stayed there till daylight, as Decoud had mentioned in the letter to his sister. Thus the capataz, instead of riding towards the Los Hatos woods as bearer of Hernandez's nomination, had remained in town to save the life of the president dictator, to assist in repressing the outbreak of the mob, and at last to sail out with the silver of the mine. But Father Corbelan, escaping to Hernandez, had the document in his pocket, a piece of official writing turning a bandit into a general in a memorable last official act of the Ribierist party, whose watchwords were honesty, peace, and progress. Probably neither the priest nor the bandit saw the irony of it. Father Corbelan must have found messengers to send into the town, for early on the second day of the disturbances there were rumours of Hernandez being on the road to Los Hatos ready to receive those who had put themselves under his protection. A strange-looking horseman, elderly and audacious, had appeared in the town, riding slowly while his eyes examined the fronts of the houses as though he had never seen such high buildings before. Before the cathedral he had dismounted, and, kneeling in the middle of the plaza, his bridle over his arm and his hat lying in front of him on the ground, had bowed his head, crossing himself and beating his breast for some little time. Remounting his horse, with a fearless but not unfriendly look round the little gathering formed about his public devotions, he had asked for the Casa Avellanos. A score of hands were extended in answer, with fingers pointing up the Calle de la Constitucion. The horseman had gone on with only a glance of casual curiosity upwards to the windows of the Amarilla Club at the corner. His stentorian voice shouted periodically in the empty street, "Which is the Casa Avellanos?" till an answer came from the scared porter, and he disappeared under the gate. The letter he was bringing, written by Father Corbelan with a pencil by the campfire of Hernandez, was addressed to Don Jose, of whose critical state the priest was not aware. Antonia read it, and, after consulting Charles Gould, sent it on for the information of the gentlemen garrisoning the Amarilla Club. For herself, her mind was made up. She would rejoin her uncle, she would entrust the last day, the last hours perhaps, of her father's life to the keeping of the bandit, whose existence was a protest against the irresponsible tyranny of all parties alike, against the moral darkness of the land. The gloom of Los Atos woods was preferable, a life of hardships in the train of a robber band less debasing. Antonia embraced with all her soul her uncle's obstinate defiance of misfortune. It was grounded in the belief in the man whom she loved. In his message the vicar general answered upon his head for Hernandez's fidelity. As to his power, he pointed out that he had remained unsubdued for so many years. In that letter Decoud's idea of the new Occidental state, whose flourishing and stable condition is a matter of common knowledge now, was for the first time made public and used as an argument. Hernandez, ex-bandit and the last general of Ribierist creation, was confident of being able to hold the tract of country between the woods of Los Atos and the coast range till that devoted patriot, Don Martin Decoud, could bring General Barrios back to Sulaco for the reconquest of the town. "Heaven itself wills it. Providence is on our side," wrote Father Corbelan. There was no time to reflect upon or to controvert his statement, and if the discussion started upon the reading of that letter in the Amarilla Club was violent, it was also short-lived. In the general bewilderment of the collapse some jumped at the idea with joyful astonishment as upon the amazing discovery of a new hope. Others became fascinated by the prospect of immediate personal safety for their women and children. The majority caught at it as a drowning man catches at a straw. Father Corbelan was unexpectedly offering them a refuge from Pedrito Montero, with his llaneros allied to Señores Fuentes and Gamacho with their armed rabble. All the latter part of the afternoon an animated discussion went on in the big rooms of the Amarilla Club. Even those members posted at the windows with rifles and carbines to guard the end of the street in case of an offensive return of the populace shouted their opinions and arguments over their shoulders. As dusk fell, Don Juste Lopez, inviting those caballeros who were of his way of thinking to follow him, withdrew into the corredor, where at the little table in the light of 2 candles he busied himself in composing an address, or rather a solemn declaration to be presented to Pedrito Montero by a deputation of such members of assembly as had elected to remain in town. His idea was to propitiate him in order to save the form at least of parliamentary institutions. Seated before a blank sheet of paper, a goose-quill pen in his hand, and surged upon from all sides, he turned to the right and to the left, repeating with solemn insistence, "Caballeros, a moment of silence! A moment of silence! We ought to make it clear that we bow in all good faith to the accomplished facts." The utterance of that phrase seemed to give him a melancholy satisfaction. The hubbub of voices round him was growing strained and hoarse. In the sudden pauses the excited grimacing of the faces would sink all at once into the stillness of profound dejection. Meantime the exodus had begun. Carretas full of ladies and children rolled swaying across the plaza, with men walking or riding by their side. Mounted parties followed on mules and horses. The poorest were setting out on foot, men and women carrying bundles, clasping babies in their arms, leading old people, dragging along the bigger children. When Charles Gould, after leaving the doctor and the engineer at the Casa Viola, entered the town by the harbour gate, all those that had meant to go were gone, and the others had barricaded themselves in their houses. In the whole dark street there was only one spot of flickering lights and moving figures, where the Señor Administrador recognized his wife's carriage waiting at the door of the Avellanos' house. He rode up, almost unnoticed, and looked on without a word while some of his own servants came out of the gate carrying Don Jose Avellanos, who, with closed eyes and motionless features, appeared perfectly lifeless. His wife and Antonia walked on each side of the improvised stretcher, which was put at once into the carriage. The two women embraced, while from the other side of the landau Father Corbelan's emissary, with his ragged beard all streaked with grey, and high bronzed cheekbones, stared, sitting upright in the saddle. Then Antonia, dry-eyed, got in by the side of the stretcher, and, after making the sign of the cross rapidly, lowered a thick veil upon her face. The servants and the 3 or 4 neighbours who had come to assist stood back, uncovering their heads. On the box, Ignacio, resigned now to driving all night, and to having perhaps his throat cut before daylight, looked back surlily over his shoulder. "Drive carefully," cried Mrs. Gould in a tremulous voice. "Si, carefully, si, Nina," he mumbled, chewing his lips, his round leathery cheeks quivering, and the landau rolled slowly out of the light. "I will see them as far as the ford," said Charles Gould to his wife. She stood on the edge of the sidewalk with her hands clasped lightly, and nodded to him as he followed after the carriage. And now the windows of the Amarilla Club were dark. The last spark of resistance had died out. Turning his head at the corner, Charles Gould saw his wife crossing over to their own gate in the lighted patch of the street. One of their neighbours, a well-known merchant and landowner of the province, followed at her elbow, talking with great gestures. As she passed in, all the lights went out in the street, which remained dark and empty from end to end. The houses of the vast plaza were lost in the night. High up, like a star, there was a small gleam in one of the towers of the cathedral, and the equestrian statue gleamed pale against the black trees of the Alameda, like a ghost of royalty haunting the scenes of revolution. The rare prowlers they met ranged themselves against the wall. Beyond the last houses the carriage rolled noiselessly on the soft cushion of dust, and with a greater obscurity a feeling of freshness seemed to fall from the foliage of the trees bordering the country road. The emissary from Hernandez's camp pushed his horse close to Charles Gould. "Caballero," he said in an interested voice, "you are he whom they call the King of Sulaco, the master of the mine? Is it not so?" "Yes, I am the master of the mine," answered Charles Gould. The man cantered for a time in silence, then said, "I have a brother, a Sereno in your service in the San Tome valley. You have proved yourself a just man. There has been no wrong done to anyone since you called upon the people to work in the mountains. My brother says that no official of the government, no oppressor of the Campo, has been seen on your side of the stream. Your own officials do not oppress the people in the gorge. Doubtless they are afraid of your severity. You are a just man and a powerful one," he added. He spoke in an abrupt, independent tone, but evidently he was communicative with a purpose. He told Charles Gould that he had been a ranchero in one of the lower valleys, far south, a neighbour of Hernandez in the old days, and godfather to his eldest boy, one of those who joined him in his resistance to the recruiting raid which was the beginning of all their misfortunes. It was he that, when his compadre had been carried off, had buried his wife and children, murdered by the soldiers. "Si, senor," he muttered hoarsely. "I and 2 or 3 others, the lucky ones left at liberty, buried them all in one grave near the ashes of their ranch, under the tree that had shaded its roof." It was to him, too, that Hernandez came after he had deserted, 3 years afterwards. He had still his uniform on, with the sergeant's stripes on the sleeve, and the blood of his colonel upon his hands and breast. 3 troopers followed him, of those who had started in pursuit but had ridden on for liberty. And he told Charles Gould how he and a few friends, seeing those soldiers, lay in ambush behind some rocks ready to pull the trigger on them, when he recognized his compadre and jumped up from cover, shouting his name, because he knew that Hernandez could not have been coming back on an errand of injustice and oppression. Those 3 soldiers, together with the party who lay behind the rocks, had formed the nucleus of the famous band, and he, the narrator, had been the favourite lieutenant of Hernandez for many, many years. He mentioned proudly that the officials had put a price upon his head too, but it did not prevent it getting sprinkled with grey upon his shoulders. And now he had lived long enough to see his compadre made a general. He had a burst of muffled laughter. "And now from robbers we have become soldiers. But look, caballero, at those who made us soldiers and him a general. Look at these people." Ignacio shouted. The light of the carriage lamps, running along the nopal hedges that crowned the bank on each side, flashed upon the scared faces of people standing aside in the road, sunk deep, like an English country lane, into the soft soil of the Campo. They cowered. Their eyes glistened very big for a second, and then the light, running on, fell upon the half-denuded roots of a big tree on another stretch of nopal hedge, caught up another bunch of faces glaring back apprehensively. 3 women, of whom one was carrying a child, and a couple of men in civilian dress, one armed with a sabre and another with a gun, were grouped about a donkey carrying 2 bundles tied up in blankets. Further on, Ignacio shouted again to pass a carreta, a long wooden box on two high wheels, with the door at the back swinging open. Some ladies in it must have recognized the white mules, because they screamed out, "Is it you, Dona Emilia?" At the turn of the road, the glare of a big fire filled the short stretch vaulted over by the branches meeting overhead. Near the ford of a shallow stream, a roadside rancho of woven rushes and a roof of grass had been set on fire by accident, and the flames, roaring viciously, lit up an open space blocked with horses, mules, and a distracted, shouting crowd of people. When Ignacio pulled up, several ladies on foot assailed the carriage, begging Antonia for a seat. To their clamor she answered by pointing silently to her father. "I must leave you here," said Charles Gould in the uproar. The flames leaped up sky high, and in the recoil from the scorching heat across the road the stream of fugitives pressed against the carriage. A middle-aged lady dressed in black silk but with a coarse manto over her head and a rough branch for a stick in her hand staggered against the front wheel. Two young girls, frightened and silent, were clinging to her arms. Charles Gould knew her very well. "Misericordia! We are getting terribly bruised in this crowd," she exclaimed, smiling up courageously to him. "We have started on foot. All our servants ran away yesterday to join the Democrats. We are going to put ourselves under the protection of Father Corbelan, of your sainted uncle, Antonia. He has wrought a miracle in the heart of a most merciless robber. A miracle!" She raised her voice gradually up to a scream as she was borne along by the pressure of people getting out of the way of some carts coming up out of the ford at a gallop, with loud yells and cracking of whips. Great masses of sparks mingled with black smoke flew over the road. The bamboos of the walls detonated in the fire with the sound of an irregular fusillade. And then the bright blaze sank suddenly, leaving only a red dusk crowded with aimless dark shadows drifting in contrary directions. The noise of voices seemed to die away with the flame, and the tumult of heads, arms, quarrelling, and imprecations passed on fleeing into the darkness. "I must leave you now," repeated Charles Gould to Antonia. She turned her head slowly and uncovered her face. The emissary and compadre of Hernandez spurred his horse close up. "Has not the master of the mine any message to send to Hernandez, the master of the Campo?" The truth of the comparison struck Charles Gould heavily. In his determined purpose he held the mine, and the indomitable bandit held the Campo by the same precarious tenure. They were equals before the lawlessness of the land. It was impossible to disentangle one's activity from its debasing contacts. A close meshed net of crime and corruption lay upon the whole country. An immense and wearied discouragement sealed his lips for a time. "You are a just man," urged the emissary of Hernandez. "Look at those people who made my compadre a general and have turned us all into soldiers. Look at those oligarchs fleeing for life, with only the clothes on their backs. My compadre does not think of that, but our followers may be wondering greatly, and I would speak for them to you. Listen, senor. For many months now the Campo has been our own. We need ask no man for anything, but soldiers must have their pay to live honestly when the wars are over. It is believed that your soul is so just that a prayer from you would cure the sickness of every beast, like the orison of the upright judge. Let me have some words from your lips that would act like a charm upon the doubts of our partida, where all are men." "Do you hear what he says?" Charles Gould said in English to Antonia. "Forgive us our misery," she exclaimed hurriedly. "It is your character that is the inexhaustible treasure which may save us all yet. Your character, Carlos, not your wealth. I entreat you to give this man your word that you will accept any arrangement my uncle may make with their chief. One word. He will want no more." On the site of the roadside hut there remained nothing but an enormous heap of embers, throwing afar a darkening red glow, in which Antonia's face appeared deeply flushed with excitement. Charles Gould, with only a short hesitation, pronounced the required pledge. He was like a man who had ventured on a precipitous path with no room to turn, where the only chance of safety is to press forward. At that moment he understood it thoroughly as he looked down at Don Jose stretched out, hardly breathing, by the side of the erect Antonia, vanquished in a lifelong struggle with the powers of moral darkness, whose stagnant depths breed monstrous crimes and monstrous illusions. In a few words the emissary from Hernandez expressed his complete satisfaction. Stoically Antonia lowered her veil, resisting the longing to inquire about Decoud's escape. But Ignacio leered morosely over his shoulder. "Take a good look at the mules, mi amo," he grumbled. "You shall never see them again." End of Part Third, Chapter 3. Recording by Nick Number.